All right, welcome back, comrades. This is the Parallax Viewer Podcast channel by your host, the Big Signorelli. Really happy to start the new year off with the new title, new project and trajectory with the Freudian Marxism, Marxist critical theory stuff, and really did well with the Derek Varn chat, and people seem to be loving it and learning a lot and reorienting their minds with the question concerning emancipatory politics, especially given its reemergence in today's discourse. But with that being said, I have a new conversation that I'm excited to, show you all with our special guest today. Some of you may know him, Professor Colin Bodayle. Colin Bodayle is a professor at Villanova, and if you know of him, he recently gave a talk that was hosted by a critical theory workshop called Heidegger and the Left. And today we will be discussing a work that he wrote, which you can access through Substack, and I'll also put it in the links below, called Why the Left Should Reject Heidegger. And so, that being said, I'll give the floor over to Colin to introduce himself some more and give a brief introduction on the crucial points of this essay and why the left should reject Heidegger. Welcome, Colin.
Hey, thanks for having me. So yeah, my name's Colin Bodayle. I'm teaching philosophy and ethics at Villanova right now. And yeah, I wrote this essay um kind of as like I guess a provocation because there's a lot of like left Heideggerianism. And there's like a lot of, I think, a sense that Heidegger is one of those inescapable figures that you have to be post-Heideggerian. And I, studied Heidegger for a long time when I was younger. And I've started to go more towards Hegel, especially when I started graduate school. I kind of just realized that like all Heidegger talks about is being, and there's some interesting stuff in there, but it wasn't giving me the same kind of framework that I wanted for really thinking through things. And then when I started studying Hegel, I felt like, oh, I have like dialectics now. I can really think through concepts in a much more rigorous manner, and it's much more compatible as someone who likes to work on like Germans from that time period with Marxist political commitments. Obviously, right? Hegel and Marx go together like very well. Um, and then I started to become more and more critical of Heidegger. Became more and more critical of some of the questions that he raises and the assumptions that he makes, which I think are in a way have become ideological to components of continental philosophy today, where it's kind of assumed that certain things Heidegger said need to be taken for granted. Um, and so the essay is, I think, unique insofar as um, like typically you would think an essay why the left should reject Heidegger would just be like because he was a Nazi, right? And kind of list Heidegger's crimes and say, Heidegger is worthy of canceling for these reasons, kind of, right? Like that kind of vibe to it. And I think that looking into all of that is very important. But, you know, that would have been a very different essay, and I would have mainly been reading a bunch of biographies of Heidegger and trying to, get a list of the crimes that he committed, or just like all of his shitty things that he did as a Nazi, right? Um, and that wouldn't be much that I think hasn't been said already. But I think what's can be sometimes more important is to do a critique of someone at the level of philosophy, to say not just Heidegger was a Nazi, don't do Heidegger stuff, right? Because that's going to maybe convince people who, you know, don't want to associate with get their name tarnished or whatever, but it's not necessarily going to convince the people who are like, well, I don't really care about that, I don't care if, there was once I saw a lecture where someone was like, Heidegger was a Nazi, but he's a Nazi who said some true things. Even Hitler believed some true things, right? Like Hitler believed the earth revolved around the sun. Does that mean, make you right? And so by criticizing Heidegger at the level of philosophy, I think it is can be more useful to kind of engage with him this way. And then also on top of that, Heidegger has been so influential that if you're wanting to distance yourself from Heidegger but still do Heideggerian philosophy, you just go become a Derridian, right? You start doing deconstruction, or if you want to do the kind of more like there's a lot of French philosophy that is Heideggerian, and so if we just cancel Heidegger without the critique of the philosophy, we're still going to encounter pervasive forms of Heideggerianism that might have assumptions that need to be questioned. And so I try to present everything I do in the most accessible language possible. It is Heidegger, so it is, the essay is not like easy, but I think that it's clear, given the kind of limits of talking about these kinds of things. So I try to talk about Heidegger's concept of ontological difference, which is this kind of big thing. And this is the difference between beings and being. So beings, in German, das Seiende, this is like a thing that is, whereas being itself is the is of those things. Being itself is similar to like, it's like that something is rather than is not, something that there's something rather than nothing. And it appears phenomenologically, because Heidegger is working in phenomenology, which I'll say more about, I'm sure, as like kind of the unconcealment, the manifestness. Although Heidegger also talks about it as a revealing and concealing, which is a kind of maybe pseudo-dialectical way of thinking about it. And I found the best way to illustrate Heidegger's concept of being quickly to like a student would be through the concept of light. So if we think about light, whenever the light comes on in a room, we see that the objects are brighter, and so we recognize the light. But you can't like shine a light onto light to illuminate the light, right? The light is like what we see in the brightness of the objects. You might say the lamp is the light. Well, the lamp is more like the source of the light, right? And we see the lamp through the light, but you don't like see the light directly. You see it through the objects that it illuminates. Being very similarly is Heidegger thinks invisibilized by the fact that we focus on what is and not the isness of it. And we might say God is the source of beings, but not being itself, because God, presumably, if you believe in God, would be too. And so being is that isness, that thatness. I argue that in Being and Time, at least, and surrounding works, I would like to maybe write a book in, I don't know, 5 years now from now, whenever I have time to do it, trying to outline this throughout his philosophy, that there's a slippage in Heidegger between like being, qua being, and the meaning of being, or being, qua being, and our understanding of being. I think this is also a fundamental contradiction, and it's one that Heidegger either tries to erase or can't really work out. And interestingly, and I don't know, maybe this is like a thing that I have started thinking through as a way to solve problems that might be a kind of like Colin original approach to questions, but like I realized like when thinking through this that one of the big debates in Heidegger scholarship is between this guy Thomas Sheehan and Richard Capobianco. Sheehan says we should forget about being. Heidegger's project was never being, it was the meaning of being. Heidegger doesn't even care about being. Capobianco is more traditional. He's like, oh, what? He's talking about being all the time. Like, what do you mean? It's just, And then Sheehan's like, well, he's talking about being in a phenomenologically reduced sense. And Capobianco is like, well, yeah, but that's where being is, this kind of thing. And so what I've been kind of seeing is that sometimes I think debates are manifestations of contradictions in philosophy. And I think this is one of them. And I think that's actually an interesting way just generally to think about philosophy debates. Like maybe sometimes when there's a debate, the question is really that there's a contradiction. Like, for example, the debate over Hegel's reviews on religion. I think Hegel's ambiguous on religion. I think he's trying to have God and not have God, right? And so that's kind of where the left-right split happens, is like he's trying to dog whistle it, right? And dog whistling is importantly always two meanings, right? Elon says, my heart goes out. And the point of it is so that there's two different interpretations of what he said, right? So sometimes it could be accidental, sometimes it, not to go on a tangent here. But okay, so what I'm realizing is that, yeah, Heidegger, I think, does mean being in a phenomenologically reduced sense. But the internal contradiction is that he like pretends like there's no other sense outside of that phenomenologically reduced sense of being other than the meaning or appearing or
Right.
understanding.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I just want to kind of like really emphasize this moment that you're highlighting, and especially I really like that example of light and the objects that it illuminates because like so if one of the things I like to think is that like okay, so being in time is one of like Heidegger's sort of magnum opus, even if he abandons the project because it was a failed project and the debate surrounding that. But like there is the sort of prolegomena to that work, which is history of the concept of time, right?
Mhm. Yeah.
And that's where he's really developing a sort of phenomenological investigation to resuscitate phenomenology from phenomenology itself in the way that it kind of is getting away from the fundamental axiom of it or maxim, which is back to the things themselves. And he goes over like intentionality, the categorical intuition of our understanding, and this sort of problem of the a priori. But I really like how like he kind of continues this investigation within the introduction of Being in Time by saying specifically, well, what is phenomenology? But like the that which reveals itself from the light of itself, right? Or that's which shows
Right.
itself by the act of showing. Um, but to me though, like it seems like even the contradiction within that is also, and maybe I'm wrong, but I just can't like I was reading the science of logic earlier and being the doctrine of being where he talks about like the sort of impossibility of like a pure being, that pure being is just an empty notion. It
Mhm.
seems like we would get into this problem of like the difference of being and beings, and that we see like only being through the way it shines. It seems like it's a form of mediation that Heidegger is trying to wrestle with, right? If there is the problem of ontology and knowing the thing, but then also the meaning of the thing, it seems like there's constantly a sort of theoretical mediation that we can't escape, that we're always retroactively going back to. It's kind of a bit of a jargony tangent, but it just seems like right then and there, like he's trying to distance himself from Hegel, but he can't avoid Hegel in that,
Yeah.
light.
Yeah, yeah, because I think like that contradiction of being and nothing that Hegel illustrates kind of shows up again in the revealing concealing. Heidegger often says that like being is like when things like in the work of art, when like the color shines and shows itself, it's red and nothing more, right? There's this and nothing, this background of nothing. Um, that is the kind of like basis for things like appearing at times. And yeah, like I haven't looked at history of concept of time in maybe 10 years, but it is one of those key texts. There's like surrounding being in time that are all very, very interesting for looking through it. Yeah, on the subject of like phenomenology itself too. There's yeah, like hold on. I wrote down something about this. It's illustrative to contrast Heidegger's phenomenology with Husserl's. It's also really interesting if you have access to the Husserliana, like the collected works of Husserl, which I don't know if everything's been published. Husserl like had a problem where he wrote way too much. Like he would like do a phenomenology of his breakfast every morning, as it were, and stuff. Like so, there's like, and then he would overwrite because he would go back and edit, which I guess too maybe like Husserl and I have like a similar divergence or something, but unlike Husserl, I go back and edit and try to make it clear. Husserl would make it more and more complex by like adding clauses and stuff. And that's why if you read like something he didn't publish, it's like so much clearer is because he like left it alone. And so it's not as like baroque, I guess. But Husserl's margin notes for being in time are available and they're quite interesting. Um, because one of the things I remember there's one margin note. I need to go back and look at it because I keep thinking about this, but he says something like all this within a phenomenological reduction to Heidegger, right? And if you're like a dyed-in-the-wool Heideggerian, like if you buy into Heidegger's project, you're like, what a silly question, Husserl. Don't you know that being is just like manifestation and stuff? But Husserl's right. Um, right? Because so phenomenology, as developed by Husserl, as I'm sure you know, but I'll say just for the benefit of the listeners, uses something called the epoche, which is basically Husserl says, okay, like we all agree there is a real world out there, right? Like nobody's actually like an idealist in the sense of like, well, I mean, we'll see at least, but like
Like a Barclay type,
like a Berkeley type, right? I mean, even Berkeley in a weird way, he just like is like matter is an idea out there kind of thing. Like nobody actually is like purely just believes like in solipsism or something, right? But Husserl says what we're going to do is methodologically suspend judgment about reality, suspend judgment about what he calls the natural attitude, the positing of the real world. And we're going to enter into this Cartesian world where everything kind of is just appearances. And the reason we're doing this is because Husserl wants to understand the kind of like inner logic, what he calls essences of, and the underlying structure of meaning behind the way things appear. And some of this I think is for Marxist too idealist in Husserl, but I think there are things that Husserl discovers within his method that are, for lack of a better word, scientific, right? Like noticing how when we see an object, we don't just see one side of an object, but we see a whole object. And we don't actually look at the side unless we kind of like look back at ourselves. Like there are things I think that Husserl discovers that are quite interesting. And one point Althusser makes at a certain point is that like Husserl was like a weirdly like in a kind of like anti-idealist alliance with Lenin for a little while against the psychologism in the psychologism debate, where they were both trying to criticize the people who were believed in psychologism. Psychologism is basically the idea that the rules of logic are hardwired into the brain, and that's why logic's true, which is leads to a really idealist position. Um, but yes, so Husserl has this suspension of belief in the existence of the eternal external world. Sometimes Husserl will switch back and forth to contrast. Like, here's what happens when we bracket or suspend judgment about the external world. Here's what happens when we go back to believing in the external world. Look at the the differences here and stuff like that. But then there's a kind of trick in Heidegger, where he just starts using the word being to describe what shows itself as phenomena, right? He just starts using the word being and Dasein and existence. And this is something Lukács criticizes in The Destruction of Reason when he talks about Heidegger. He says, like, he kind of uses all these words that come from me and redefines them, which is like a weird thing in itself. And we don't think about that because we read Heidegger in translation for the most part. And like I first learned German to understand Heidegger. And so like I don't know what it's like to be a German and then like read Heidegger for the first time in German. But there's especially back then, but there's something weird. Like even the word Dasein, if you read like Kant, like he says like when he says like proof for the existence of God, Dasein of God, right? And now Heidegger's like this means human being. So there's something
Right.
very
Even
strange
Hegel has
going
a
on. Yeah.
Dasein thing too. Even he
Yeah.
mentions it. Yeah. But it's like
Yeah.
not
Yeah.
the same.
Yeah, and for Hegel, Dasein is just like something finite that it's a what that exists. Instead of being like thatness and the abstract, it's like there's this thing that exists, right? Like the pen exists as opposed to being like, right? Like and so there's a sense in which there's this kind of switch going on where like Heidegger is saying meaning of being and treating this in a kind of phenomenological sense as if this were the only sense of being. But then you're like, well, what about real being out there? Well, Heidegger wants to kind of loop that all back into subjectivity, loop that back all into appearance. And then history, science, all objectivity becomes historicized within Dasein's existence, within Dasein's and other Daseins too that are there, own kind of, he doesn't want to say subjectivity, but what he uses the word existence. The fact that Dasein's there is necessary for everything else to kind of be there in a weird way too. And I'm not sure it even can be made sense of the fact that like he says that beings are independent of Dasein, but being isn't. Well, you just said are independent, right? And if you're not acknowledging that you're using an epoche, if you're not acknowledging that you're engaged in a exercise, you're like, for method, I'm going to pretend the world doesn't exist out there to see what I find that I can just know in a kind of Cartesian sense, 100% sure because it's just in my mind. But you're actually saying like we're not even going to say that being can be attributed to anything out there, that being is somehow only within an understanding of being. It kind of
Yeah.
leads itself to this this idealism. And like, when people talk about postmodernism, right? This is what they're really like, this is like the complaint, right? Is that postmodernism reduces everything to like structures of meaning, to history, to human existence and human activities and human practice and all this stuff. And Heidegger kind of allows for that because he's not like an old school idealist where he's like everything is just in consciousness. It's like everything's within existence and human practice and stuff like that, right?
Right, and but like with even with the way that human practice and human existence or just Dasein aiming towards something, it isn't what would make it align with the sort of complaint with postmodernism is that like it doesn't give way to an overarching like arche or meta narrative that you would see like with philosophy, and political theory prior to Heidegger or humanism or even what you know Heideggerians or the French theorists like Foucault, who are very inspired by Heidegger, Deleuze, very inspired by Heidegger, would try to criticize Marxism for being well, it's more Lyotard that uses the term meta narrative, but the point is that some type of meaning, some type of telos,
Mhm.
for lack of a better term. Whereas it seems like there's not really any of that in Heidegger, maybe like, or at
Mhm.
least like Dasein for him doesn't give way to that, and maybe that is the sort of imminent polemic that he's kind of making with his sort of disdain towards Marxism or
Mhm.
humanism as Marxism.
Yeah, yeah, he has this whole critique of humanism where he's like, we need to have an anti-humanist Marxism. I mean, he doesn't say that. Sorry, Althusserians. I don't mean to lump you in. Although I think that we should explore the influence of Heidegger on Althusser. I was reading uh, Althusser this week for a class I'm auditing at Villanova, and we were talking about interpolation and the whole like. There's a scene that Althusser describes where like you're like walking on the street and the cop is like, "Hey, you," and you turn around and he's like, "This illustrates like how you're subjected to ideology." There's something very Heideggerian about that whole idea.
Yeah, it's almost very synonymous like thrownness, right?
Yeah.
Or like the talk of the they, right?
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then I wonder if like he tried to grapple with that. It seems like even like in his like uh disdain for Hegel and realizing like what he did wrong by like jettisoning the dialectic like a la Hegel from his new interpretation of Marxism, like to avoid falling into some type of Heideggerianism, he's like Spinoza, that's his
Yeah.
sort
Yeah.
of like fallback.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. And I like Spinoza, so I tend to enjoy some of those parts of Althusser for sure. I'd like to do a deeper reading of it. But yeah, like yeah, the letter on humanism too. Something a lot of people don't know is that so Heidegger, I think someone needs to do a study of the rehabilitation of Heidegger. Like I think it'd be really interesting for someone, maybe I'll do it. Who knows? Right, to do in the style that Gabriel Rockhill has done for like the Frankfurt School or French theory or things like this, to actually just look at the material history of like who paid the piper for Heidegger, the Nazi, to become such a respectable philosopher. But one thing I do know is that in that like process, Heidegger originally tried to reach out to Sartre to be like, hey, let me back in, right? Like I want to be rehabilitated, and Sartre was like, I'm not touching this. Um, so he ends up addressing the letter on humanism to Jean Boufflers, um, who was a Holocaust denier and had some fascist ties and stuff like this, from what I've heard. So like, there's like some questionable shit going on there, basically. But yeah, so in the letter on humanism, Heidegger makes this move to try to like throw a bone to the Marxists, where he wants to basically bring in Marxism a la critique of technology into conversation with his own thought. But I forget exactly how he puts it. But there's something along the lines of like Marxism has to think through alienation as alienation from being, right? It has to take and there are like forms of Marxism that emphasize the alienation stuff, I think a little bit on the like too much side of things. Um, right? But it has to be that kind of like it has to take up alienation as like the main starting point. It can't be too materialist. It can't be like too it's like the it has to be like the young Marx kind of thing. And it has to be rooted in kind of this existential feeling of alienation and to connect that to this larger metaphysics of the history of being, right? So I don't know.
Yeah, no, it's so interesting thinking of that because like then there's like, this sort of distance that, from the Slovene school want to make clear that like one, they're like overcoming Althusser a la Lacan, and then also emphasize this tip of constitutive alienation. But like I'm thinking of like just like not only these sort of polemics back then, not just in Heidegger, but also like in Marxism itself with
Mhm.
the Marxist humanist and then the anti-humanist, the Marxist humanists like Raya Dunyaskaya, CLR James, Marcuse, etc., that focus on the young Marx and the Marx of thinking of alienation in the 1844 manuscripts. But what caught my, eye was what you said regarding like not too much of alienation in being where we get in this existentialism. Like someone like Istvan Mazaros, who did a work on alienation to outline the way that the theory of alienation, not only historically but also theoretically and methodologically, operates in Marx, is that like Marx never denied that there is some type of alienation that is, you could say, for lack of a better term, constitutive to man, and it is just simply that we rely on nature, and the way we sort of metabolize the our relationship with nature is already a form of like alienation, but like mediation. But like we're dealing with the mediation under capitalism in which we are alienated by the products of our labor, the alienation from others, alienation from nature, and alienation from self. And this is like a problem of capitalism that we're trying to sublate, right? And so
Mhm.
like I think like like something that Heidegger is doing with that seems to sort of try to again get one up on Marxism, but then also like the way that he talks about technology, as he says specifically in that question concerning technology, is from an ontological status of what is a technology. And so he like
Mhm.
evokes like uh what is it, the four types of causality from Aristotle, right? And
Right.
like he
Yeah.
tries to add a new form of causality with the ontological questioning of technology.
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, that I have to go back and look at the four where he goes from the four causes to the other part of that, just because I don't remember it off the top of my head. I remember reading it. But yeah, it's interesting because in Aristotle, generally speaking, Aristotle likes to draw analogies from the productive arts, right? So like he wants to think about, I'm teaching Aristotle, or I just finished teaching Aristotle this week in ethics. He's like, like what's the function of like a builder, right? To build things, where it's like, well, what's the function of a human being? Where it's like to use your capacities, to have the virtues and things like this. And then when he thinks about metaphysics, Aristotle wants to understand nature on the basis of what he calls like the poetic arts, which aren't like poetry, but poesis is like to make, kind of something along those lines in Greek. Um, so like Aristotle's like, okay, when a person makes a statue, they take matter and they shape it into a form. So we're going to use form and matter to understand natural things, right? Um, and so there is like Heidegger is, he's careful with the Greeks enough to recognize that these are the kinds of categories it works, and these are the ways that Aristotle's conceiving being. Um, Marx too is kind of Aristotle was his favorite Greek philosopher, and he's somebody who wrote a dissertation on Greek philosophy. He quotes Aristotle in Capital, and much like Aristotle, um, who was really thinking about things in terms of human production, Marx is also thinking about things in terms of human production. Also draws his categories out of thinking about labor. Understands, like the relation of like theory to its object through praxis, which is a very kind of Aristotelian thing as well. Um, but when it comes to the question concerning technology, Heidegger's general point of view is that being in the 20th century is understood in terms of technology. So you have like, I think, four general epochs of the history of being for Heidegger. You have the kind of Greek epoch where being is understood in terms ultimately of Aristotle's unmoved mover and motion, which is kind of a weird claim considering like there are a lot of Greeks, right? And like, what about all the periods of time where like Stoicism was popular and all this stuff? Heidegger is a very I mean, it's a version of history that was invented by Germans for reasons of white supremacy, really. But right, like this is very vague picture of history, very Eurocentric. But then you have the Middle Ages, being is understood as created being. Um, the modern period, being is understood as something that's present to a subject, as a representation of a subject. And then finally, you have technology, where being is understood as the exercise of the will to power, our will to exercise our will, and ultimately secure possibilities for our willing, which he sees as Nietzsche and Marx, who he sees as inversions of Hegel, which is it is a strange claim. Um, One way you could actually flip this on its head a little bit is to point out that like there is a weird way in which like you could maybe argue that these different epochs of metaphysics, which I don't necessarily believe Heidegger describes well, but if there are changes, they could better be explained by class structure, right? So like Greek metaphysics is probably better explained by as reflections of slave societies, right? So-called Christian metaphysics. I mean, this is the ideology of feudalism, and then what we would, as Marxists would call idealism, the idea that what being is the representation of something to a subject. This would be liberal or bourgeois system, right, of thinking, because like the idea is like there is no like chain of being, there's no hierarchy. Instead, everything is what I produce myself or what I will myself, the contract I submit to. Like that's the way that bourgeois philosophy kind of conceives itself, in terms of this kind of very abstract notion of freedom. And then finally, what we have like the final epoch of metaphysics, and it's kind of just like I don't know what you would call it, but I mean like in a way Heidegger seems to associate it with communism. So I mean I don't know, like we just have like technology and the will to like will whatever we want. I mean I don't know, maybe it sounds base. Maybe we should embrace Das Gestell, the final epoch of the history of being or whatever. But like there is like a weird like connection there is what I'm trying to say. Um, what's ultimately I think not helpful about Heidegger's history of technology is that his idea is that everything is being produced as objects for our will to keep on willing, which you could think about in terms of like use value, right? Because ultimately he wants to say that like everything's being measured so that it can be controlled. What science is a way of just figuring out how we can exercise our human will on things, how we can make things objects of our praxis, which is a Marxist way of seeing it, too, which Heidegger thinks is bad. Um, and he says this is going to take away the possibility for anything to reveal itself any other way, which would be this kind of weird poetic Holderlin thing that he's thinking about of just like the thing just is there and just kind of like shows itself, shows its being. Um, But from a Marxist standpoint, I don't think this is a adequate interpretation of like so-called postmodernism, because what we understand to be the driving force of our contemporary times is not securing everything for the will. I mean, it's more so that we are that what's driving everything in our own time is the production of exchange value through surplus value extraction, right? And there's all kinds of things that can't be the objects of human willing, um, because they're, externalities to that surplus value accumulation, right? And so like really like Heidegger, I think, mistakes like, for Marx, it's like use value can't even really appear because it's all in the mode of exchange value. Heidegger misses exchange value completely and thinks that use value is the form that things are appearing in. When like if things appeared in forms of use value as like objects of our will to like move, why wouldn't we fix the climate catastrophe, right? Or something like this. So yeah.
Yeah, no, that's so good. And I really liked how you brought in the fact that like his notion of like history or just like historically trying to go back to these different epochs are so like limited, Eurocentric, of course, but like the point is that like this sort of thinking, you could see in many Marxists, whether it's like Lacerda, Lukács, and our fellow comrade Daniel Tutt, talk about like the problematic of like the Nietzschean influence and Heideggerian influence like on the left, but like the methodology of whether it's the archaeology, the genealogy, or like the Heidegger's use of like historicizing, it's not predicated on anything materialistic of a history in the Marxist sense. Domenico Lacerdo in his Nietzsche book says that like, the Hellenism and the ancient Greek period that Nietzsche is focused on, and even in the works of like Foucault, are not anything related to actual history at all, but are like saints, Catholic, no, what is it? Saints and icons to the Catholic, pretty much. Like they are just like sort of fetishisms and modes of mystifying um their, conception of whether it is like a will to power, the sort of a rank and order of Nietzsche, whether it's Dasein or like this sort of subject that of Foucault that he's working on, especially like in his archaeology, and like this lack of periodization, because like, you could see the same thing in Heidegger with these epochs. It's like the same thing in Foucault, where like Foucault can lay out like an analysis of 19th century or 18th century France with the construction of the Bastille, but can't account for like the revolution or the 1848 event, which in Marxist conception of history, we're always looking at these sort of points of antagonism and overdetermination, which is very lacking in any analysis that's Heideggerian, Nietzschean, or Foucauldian. And I triangulate them because they're almost like piggybacking off of one another. Both Foucault and Heidegger are influenced by Nietzsche in a
Oh yeah.
highly an extreme way. Um, and one of the things about like what you pointed out with like Marx is, he did like Aristotle a lot. And one of the things that again Esteban Mazzaro says that one of the things that Greek thinkers, especially Aristotle, couldn't conceive is a notion of alienation, because for Aristotle, right, because again he lived in a slave society, some of his metaphysical notions were influenced and piggybacked off the background of that. And so he couldn't conceive of an alienated subject on its way to freedom, because it was so naturalized. We were born free or born a slave. That was
Mhm.
our sort of nature. Whereas like once we get into like the development of bourgeois thought, things like alienation or freedom as such as a concept to strive for was made more accessible, but then only realized in the light of what Isvan will say as like the outsider philosopher. So you can think of the outsider philosopher as Socrates, which questions the sort of doxa of society, but then someone like Rousseau, Spinoza, and
Mhm.
Marx were sort of on the periphery of the society in which they lived in. And because they were always moving, they could see the sort of granular unfoldment of not only history, but of, the political subject in question, for lack of a better term. Um,
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
uh,
absolutely.
I, I I'm enjoying this conversation. Obviously, I could ramble on and go back and forth with you, but to kind of maintain the thread of conversation, I did have some questions in mind regarding Heidegger and your essay, and I think you outlined in the beginning, the relationship to phenomenology, ontological difference, and my question regarding the points in your essay is like, what makes Heidegger's fundamental ontology and ontological difference opposed to the materialism of Marxism, dialectic
Mm.
materialism, and the historical materialism.
Yeah, important question. So it's it's weird because I don't think people always notice this in Heidegger, although it's right there. Heidegger is so a lot of people talk about Heidegger as being this critic of Descartes, right? He's a critic of the subject. He's a critic of the subject-object distinction. He's supposed to have like solved the subject-object distinction with Dasein somehow, right? We're we frequently hear this claim. Um, what and then we hear, okay, well, what's his problem with Descartes? Well, Descartes wants to put everything into the I think, therefore I am, into the subject, right? This is a kind of like ideologized version of Heidegger that you find popping up in all kind of like, postmodern theory, um, also like in like newer kind of stuff like decolonial theory, like not all decolonial theory, obviously, but the kind of very phenomenologically oriented decolonial theory. But then actually open being and time and see what he talks about with Descartes. There are a few words I think about the I think therefore I am, but Heidegger's beef with Descartes in being and time is not with his concept of the subject, it's with his concept of what is called the res extensia or extended substance. It's a critique of Descartes' materialism. It's a critique of Descartes' concept of like physical matter. And it does have a secondary target of Husserl's ideas too. Husserl actually has like a kind of phenomenology of matter that not a lot of people have discovered. I wrote an essay on it in 2016 in a very small journal in Malta that one of my friends ran. There's a lot in that essay that I don't like. I use some things that I now consider kind of ideological. Like I tried to like make connections to new materialism, because I was a young grad student and I was trying to be like, oh, look, I'm up to date or whatever. And now I'm like, I'm not as interested in this. And I'm not sure if phenomenology or idealism is where to go for a theory of matter, but there is a theory of like the phenomenology of matter in Husserl that Heidegger's criticizing there. And so like for Heidegger, it's like we can't start with this position that things are objective, physical, material things in a world within time. And then they, out of this comes living things and then eventually humans and then societies. For Heidegger, everything is initially within this social context. A hammer, he talks about this in, I think the greatest part of being in time, the part that I think everyone should read, and I think that has a great amount of value, although I think we should push the limits of it, is his tool analysis. It's good, you have to say, like, you have to admit while reading it, like, okay, like Heidegger, if only he had chosen a different path for himself, right? Because great, great creative mind with this stuff. So like a hammer for Heidegger fits into the context of an entire practice that includes the nails that you have to drive in to build a house, to provide shelter, and everything within the world kind of shows up in this nexus of significance, all connected around human praxis. And so it's not mind, it's like this kind of like what he calls circumspection,
Right,
Umsichen,
the
yeah,
referent, the
the
referent in
reference, yeah,
time.
yeah. And then objects as like individual objective physical things for Heidegger are second order. So at one point he gives a kind of practical version of this. Whenever like an object breaks, then our attention, right? Because like one of the things is like when you're hammering with a hammer, you can be doing whatever you want, thinking about whatever you're doing. You're not actually like explicitly like cognizing what you're doing. Once it's like become a habit and you're taking care of you're doing your business and then just like you know thinking about something else, but it breaks and then you encounter it as an object. So Heidegger thinks that that kind of like objective physical thing pops out in that moment, but then he also sees like theorizing as another form of practice that strips things out of that context, strips things out of that referential totality, and then uses concepts like matter, whatever, space, time, cause to construct this scientific theory. But this is situated within this social context, within this referential totality, and then ultimately within history. And so what you get is material things. Materiality gets collapsed into subject or sociality, I guess you could put it, because it's not exactly subjectivity. It is subjective, but it's like the lived world. And so matter as extended substance, Heidegger thinks begins from the standpoint of what he calls, and I wrote this wrong in my notes, but Vorhandensein, or presence at hand, existence in the ordinary sense of the world, of like there is just something that is there. It's the fact that it is within space and time in the present moment at a certain location. That for Heidegger is the older definition of being. It's what Derridians would call this the metaphysics of presence. Um, all like objectivity for Heidegger is the result of a praxis that objectifies in a secondary order something by stripping it out of that more original context. Now there's like a kernel of truth here, because like as Marxists, we know that like to discover objectivity, like practice is the test, right? And there is a sense that we have to abstract things from their context to find out what they are and then return back to the concrete. But what's missing in Heidegger is like that there's no move back from the objective to the social and how it's like upheld by being having a base, right? He shows how like within the superstructure we get to objectivity if we were to like transpose it into Marxist terms, but he doesn't understand how like the base supports this lived world or anything like this. And so what Heidegger turns into is he turns into a kind of historicism. He turns into a kind of subjective historicism where the natural sciences, which Heidegger wants to say, the natural sciences really do discover true things, but they do so on the basis of certain assumptions, certain basic concepts, certain social practices that determine what counts as a being for a scientific investigation. And so at the end and this is where you get the kind of reflexive scientific anti-realism of anti-realism is a fancy word for idealism of a lot of continental philosophy. If you think about postmoderns too, like someone like Lyotard at one point says reality is just whatever establishment procedures within society say is real, right? Like,
Yeah, it's super it becomes super idealistic too, and like even deprivileges the, objectivity, effectivity, and transformation that scientific practices have. And that's the one thing that Marxists do privilege, even if it's under the jurisdiction of a bourgeois ideology. Science is important. Science was also like we could criticize the failures of the USSR in Chinese in China under Mao and the problems of China now, but like science was in fact something that had concrete materiality, not only in the level of discourse, but on the sort of way that it transforms the base and the superstructure, which like what you see in this sort of Heideggerian spin-off is like there's only a sort of superstructural function to science, but it's only, and like this is the effect that you get of French Heideggerianism and structuralism, is that it really only matters in the form of the episteme or the discourse, right? And not on the way that it is sort of something that transforms human society or just, any sort of human practice, whether it's theoretical, scientific, etc. Like the Heideggerianism is on the discourse itself. And I say
yeah,
Heideggerianism just because obviously there is a more complexity to Heidegger versus the Heideggerianism.
yeah, absolutely. So one thing too is like Althusser is quite good on the subject of science, like his like philosophy, what is it, spontaneous philosophy of the scientists. um he he has some stuff I don't agree with in there, like some of his conceptual stuff, some of his structuralism, but he sees like whenever there's a crisis of science, there's always this split between the people who say, well, it's just like, science is just our best guesses, it's all probabilistic and all this stuff, versus he says like there's a class struggle that takes place in theory in the scientific revolution, like in the Kuhnian sense, between idealism and materialism. And like what the Marxists need to do is like, no, science is real. It tells us what the world's really like. Um, Zizek has some moments like this too, where he talks about quantum physics and he's like, no, God actually left it incomplete. Like that's like I think maybe an inadequate answer, but like
Or even like Badu with like science having a truth event, right? And this is where
yeah.
philosophy has to like deprivileges its hierarchy. It's like it doesn't create truths, it only ascertains the truth events from science and politics, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, and so like there's this sense in which one has to take the side of materialism in these things. And I think, Marxism, I mean, like signifiers didn't put the first human being in space. Let's just put it that way. Or the first woman in space, or the first black person in space. I believe that some Marxists who believed in the reality of science did that back in the USSR. So, but but yeah, I think there's like this sense in which we talked about something a second ago that I wanted to make a point about. You talked about Lasorda's reading of Nietzsche and the whole idea of saints, right? Where they look back at Greece and they say, oh, like they view them as saints. They don't want to actually know what happened in Greece. They just want to have these heroic figures, right? That's explicitly Heidegger's understanding of history. That's explicitly what Heidegger thinks history about is about. It's not about what happened. It's not about looking back. I mean, think about these debates we're having about 1776, right? With like Gerald Horne and stuff like that. I tend to be on the side of the Gerald Horne position on this thing. And you know, but sometimes the question when we have these debates isn't like, who really was George Washington and Thomas Jefferson? It's, oh, can this like rally the proletariat? Like, or like, can this like be a model of a revolution or this kind of stuff? Like, that's what Heidegger thinks history is for. That, and I think that approach is what a lot of fascists too see history is about. History is about looking to these figures to just use as kind of propaganda and not about being like, well, what were the material conditions that happened? What produced these figures? Well, whose side were they on? Right? Like,
Right.
um,
And I think that's also sort of the problem too of like the platypus understanding of the American Revolution because they still will deprivilege like the material reality of it by saying, well, no, like it's not settler colonialism. What it was that, the institution of something like civil society in which anybody, regardless if they were a slave or like if they were indigenous that one day they too can participate in civil society, where it's like it's this so much like emphasis on civil society and not on the material reality and the contradictions of the struggle that you end up sort of reorienting a new form of fetishism onto, the American Revolution on
right.
civil society.
Yeah. Funny thing about that too is like, it's like, what do you think people in Russia today learn about the American Revolution? The answer is nothing. They learn about the French Revolution, but not the American Revolution. Do you think people in England study it? Do you think people in like France are like reading about George Washington? It's like no. And it's like, oh, but you don't understand. Like Ho Chi Minh this one time said that the American Revolution was good, so we must like endorse it because of this one thing. Or like Lenin, at one point like praises the American Revolution. Like, where's Lenin's book on the American Revolution? You know what I mean? Like he's just a dude, right? Like he's not a scholar of the American Revolution. Like, if it was if a comment about imperialism that he made, well, he wrote the book on imperialism, but he didn't write the book on the American Revolution. So there's this very strange. I think it's a very very kind of insular to America and to American education, which is so American centric, not just Eurocentric, but American centric. It's like George Washington, greatest person who ever. The entire face of the world was changed by him, and it's like nobody cares about him outside of the United States, right?
That's so funny. One of the things though I wanted to touch on still regarding this question, because you brought up a lot regarding the thing about not only like assignment, referential totality, and even like how science sort of just only like affects this sort of, to use the Marxist term, superstructure, or like uh the sort of uh social totality, or like as the sort of French Heideggerians and structuralists will say, symbolic order. And I know Lacan will mean that totally different from that, but that's neither here nor there. But it makes me think of then what Heidegger will then distinguish in his ontology of the difference between, was it the ontological and the ontic? And
Mm,
he has what the existential and the existentiel. Um,
yeah.
and so for him, right, science would fall under the ontic, right? But it doesn't reveal anything about being as such, right? Or the existential, the ontological.
Yeah, yeah. So I'll just review the categories real quick if I can I think I can do that off the top of my head. So Ontic has to do with like the beings that exist, whereas ontological has to do with the question of being in general, or like the kind of like conditions for the possibility of understanding anything as a being whatsoever. So like he'll talk about the ontic sciences. And those are the ones that basically treat their subject matters as objects, right? So biology would be an ontic science, even though biology studies human beings, because biology doesn't study human existence in the existentialist kind of sense of existence, right? It treats human beings like a thing that's present at hand. Um, and that goes back to this one of Heidegger's big things, and we'll get to time at some point, is this notion of presence and present moment presence. Um, or anthropology takes human beings as an object, but Heidegger wants to say that human beings are Dasein. One could say human beings are subjects. Heidegger does use that language sometimes. Like if you read his debate with Cassirer, like he uses like subject and subjectivity a lot more freely there. That's in the end of the Kant book. They have it there. Funnily enough, after that debate, Emmanuel Levinas attended the debate. Of all people, Levinas is known for being really anti-Heideggerian, but he was really team Heidegger at the time. He thought like Heidegger trashed Cassirer, and he and his friends went to a bar and were drinking and were imitating the debate. They were reenacting it. And Levinas was like up on the table pretending to be Cassirer when Cassirer walked in and he was like mocking. And so like apparently like Levinas like carried that guilt with him, and I think he even apologized to like Cassirer's wife, if I remember right. I don't remember I didn't read the story. Someone told this to me, but I was like, wow, this is hilarious. But yeah, he uses the term subjectivity a lot. And so existential, that's like the sense of like pertaining to the existence of Dasein, and being an existential structure. I'm not sure if I could list them all off the top of my head. I feel like making lists of things is something I should have been doing. There's nowhere in Being and Time where he has a column with all of them. And then existential is like a particular, so like I think an example would be like what he calls what is it, Befindlichkeit, attunement is like an existential. That's like the structure that lets us be like affected by, it's like the structure of affect, whereas like fear or angst would be an existential because it's like a particular, it's something that grips us existentially, but it's not a structure. Like angst is not, or I don't know, maybe angst is weird, but like fear is not a structure of Dasein's being. It's something that grips our existence, I guess. I think that that's the distinction. It's been a while since I looked at the existential distinction, but so yeah, the ontic sciences, Heidegger wants to say those are all second order to this more fundamental understanding of Dasein's existence, and even history, as we would understand it, of like history of what actually took place when, that's considered ontic and not ontological, whereas Heidegger would want to replace that with an existential understanding of history. Where it matters is not like how whoever, like Lenin or George Washington or whoever existed then, but how they exist today. Um, and that's worthy of criticizing. There's something too, like where you get in this posture, Kwame Nkrumah in Conscientism talks about like two different ways of approaching historical figures. And he wants to distinguish between how he thinks that basically Europeans who are, either invested in the colonial project or are products of of colonialism think, and how they try to train people in the colonies to think, versus how people who are anti-colonial, who are, dialectical materialists, would think about historical figures. What he says is that when like people in the core, and he's thinking mainly of analytic philosophy because he studied with like Ayer and was like part of that movement. When they see someone like Hegel, they're like, "Oh, the great Hegel," and it kind of is like a kind of symbol of cultural achievement, right? It's like something where they're like, "Oh, this is a figure of European culture," kind of like people be like George Washington, that's an American hero, or whatever, right? And then he
Or
says like, that's not
Bud
how
Light.
Bud Light, right? Yeah, and he's like, that's not how like people who are colonized should read these figures like Hegel or Kant or whoever. Or, since he would call himself a dialectical materialist, I would say extend this to dialectical materialists generally, that instead what they need to do is they need to look at how these figures fit into the political debates and fights of their time, what side they took, and how their philosophical practice was ultimately like situated as taking a certain stance and a certain fight in that struggle, because then that teaches you how to fight today. You look at how they fought using philosophy back then, and that teaches you how to fight today. That's how he reads like, the pre-Socratics, which he reads, in ways that has similarities to Heidegger, but is also very different. Where he says like, because like the alternative is just be like fuck George Washington, right? Like, or this guy was a a Nazi, or this guy was whatever, or Hegel was Eurocentric, which he was, right? And to just take down the historical figure and to like try to like destroy their reputation. But I think the historical materialist perspective, while there are times for taking people like George Washington down a peg for sure, like is to actually just figure out like, well, what happened? Who were on what sides, right? What for the people who were enslaved or the indigenous people, what was this figure doing, right? Where did they stand on abolition? Like one of the most important, issues. That's like a good litmus test. Like, Marx, where did he stand on abolition? He was an abolitionist, like did Marx say some things that weren't great at times? Sure. But like at the end of the day, that, right?
Right, and I guess like this is where like with the historical materialist side and maybe even like Lacerda, because we've been mentioning him a lot, like his idea of the or not idea, his method of the counter history
Yeah.
is to like create like well, for Nietzsche it's like a balance sheet, to look at like not only autobiography or a biography of him, but also like the way in which his ideas operated on, the multiple sides of history. And
Mhm.
then like, one of the things that I liked with his liberalism text is like he's looking at like all the sort of infamous figures of like whether it's like of Great Britain or of America or just like all of the liberal tradition. And rather than seeing them as like, again, like these saints or monumental statues that we could be like, oh, what great figures or like they built the ideas for modern man, seeing how like there's a sort of averse side which their liberalism was predicated on an unwillingness to acknowledge the lack of liberty that other people, the slaves, the colonized people, lacked. They lacked freedom, but yet at the same time, they were perfectly okay in their correspondences with other prominent figures and aristocrats regarding slavery as something necessary. And I think that's like what is like so brilliant about Lacerda's method of the counter history as like a form of dialectical materialism.
Yeah, I agree. And I was actually just thinking that too, like that Lasorda is such a great example of practicing historical materialism as counter history. Because like, yeah, like his I've only read the introduction of the liberalism book. I need to finish the whole thing. But like in Western Marxism, for example, or in his Heidegger books like this too, right? Like he'll take each figure and he'll try to situate them. When did they write this? What positions did they take? What positions did other people take at the same time in the same issue? Um, he does this with Heidegger in his Heidegger book in a very interesting way, where he's like here's like Shaler, here's Heidegger, here's Max Weber, here's Jaspers, here's where they all stood on this issue. And then there'll be like characters that are like litmus tests too, where he'll be like, okay, now let's see what like a conservative who wasn't a Nazi was saying, or something like that, and read them into the picture. And then you kind of get like the pressure points on a lot of people of like, okay, where did they actually like take a stand where the rubber meets the road? I think this is really interesting with Hegel too. I've again only read the introduction to his Hegel book. I've been meaning to go through it, but with like someone like Hegel, you could just sit down and read the philosophy and be like, okay, what's Hegel's position? And if you just sat down and read it, you'd be like, oh, wait, he believes in kings? Like, what? You're a monarchist or whatever? And it's like, oh, constitutional monarchist. But then you look at like Hegel, the person, and like, okay, well, for one thing, like all of his ideas were built off of liberalism. He drank to Bastille Day every day. He put up like 3 months' salary worth of bail money to bail one of his like revolutionary students out of jail. He defended like his students when they were, going to be like kicked out of the university for uh, defending like revolutionary ideas, like including like an assassination of a reactionary and stuff like that. When it's like, okay, like Hegel was on, maybe he wasn't like Marx or something, but like Hegel was on the progressive side of things through like his
Right.
actions when you situate him in history. But when you read him on his own, you're like, wow, Hegel sounds like a total reactionary.
Yeah, and
Something.
he also practices according to Lacerdo self-censorship in his
Right.
writings, which was a way to kind of like conceal what like his sort of political things were. And like again, he uses this litmus test to look at different translations of the philosophy of right in juxtaposing that from the lectures that he gave on the philosophy of right. And you see a total disconjunction from the common doxa And he's analyzing a lot of these conservative him as Lacerda is analyzing these conservative Hegelians that are sort of analyzing the philosophy of right and taking him to be a sort of monarchist, or then others that see him as a sort of liberal contractualism, and then sort of looking at all these ways in which he's self-censored himself regarding certain political issues, then showing like, well, this is why uh if there's any kernel of truth to his progressive, or sort of not even progressive, radical thought, it is specifically what a lot of Hegelians of the philosopher of right fail to really take into account is the rational as actual, like that distinction between like the real and the actual and the rational. And this is what like is sort of uh paving the way for Marx and Engels with their understanding of revolutionary history, and why like for them Marx or Hegel was like the last philosopher, because he gave us, that kernel of truth for philosophy to be put on the streets and not just in the academia.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and that's like, yeah, it's very interesting. I've been like trying to actually work on some new areas of thinking about self-censorship within Hegel, because it's I mean, there's a line, I think we'll sort of maybe quotes it by Heinrich Heine, where it's something along the lines of like, there's a reason German philosophers are so difficult to read. It's not because they can't write clearly. It's because he says, fear the results of their own thinking, right? On matters of religion and politics, and in a way that they fear, getting in trouble for what they're saying. And yeah, Lasorda has that great example of in the philosophy of right, like text. It's like this really obscure, like conceptual movement, and then like in the lectures, he's like, yeah, you can totally steal bread if your family's starving. Like Hegel's like, that's nothing wrong with that. Um, which yeah, actually, I've been thinking about this because I was talking about Aristotle in my class, and we were talking about the example of like, if your family is held hostage and going to be killed if you don't rob a bank, and then you rob a bank. I think I was suggesting that from Aristotle's perspective, like he's like, oh, you really care about your family then? Like that actually shows some courage, right? You went and robbed a bank for them? Like hell yeah. Like, like I don't know if Aristotle would like personally like 100% be on board with that, but like there's a sense in which um the like there was actually like a virtue there or whatever. And so I've been thinking more and more of like, maybe at the end of the day, Hegel is really just like an Aristotelian on some of these things. But
Right, right, because he was critical of the categorical imperative and a lot of like, in the phenomenology, most of like the sort of law of the heart and what's the other one, the beautiful soul, that comes from like
yeah,
a critique of deontology, if I'm not understanding right, if I
yeah,
understand correctly.
yeah. His critique of the categorical imperative is interesting because he wants to uphold a certain amount of Kant. Like he thinks that Kant placed freedom at the heart of things, and that was good. And he thinks that like Kant's focus on duty has something right about it. But Hegel wants to be like, you can't just like fall back on intentions without looking at results. He wants to bring in teleology and purpose and aim. Because for Hegel, like it's about the realization of, to put it in a kind of a more Marxist way, like we need to act in such a way that realizes the conditions for the possibility of freedom. Not just like, not just like prove ourselves free with the categorical imperative, but actually like create freedom. Like, I mean, it's really not far from there that you get into a radical politics, right? And like, yeah, so Hegel is trying to incorporate like the action side, and then his famous critique of the categorical imperative is that the empty formalism objection, where he basically says that like if there was no such thing as property, there'd be no such thing as theft, right? But like if everything was owned in common, then property would be theft, right? Like in the kind of Proudhonian sense, right? So there's like a sense in which private property versus common property is the presupposition that determines which violates the categorical imperative.
No, that's so interesting. Yeah. I mean, yeah, I never thought of it like that, but that's so true. I guess since we're talking about Hegel now, we could bring in one of the points of your essay, is regarding not only again like the notion of being in Heidegger, but then how it is sort of appropriate, like, well, Hegel's notion of being in the logic is appropriated by Heidegger, but he wants to take some distance. So like my question is like, can you go more into depth on Heidegger's reliance of
Yeah.
Hegel's dialectic and the science of logic regarding being, but at the same time, why does he find it necessary to sort of avoid the conclusion that pure being, and pure being according to Hegel is nothing but an empty determinacy, nothing but an abstraction. Because that's literally how he starts off the doctrine of being, as like a concept that exists in and of itself, right? But like if we're talking about pure immediacy, it is a nothingness. And that's why the whole thing with the dialectics is like, immediacy is already mediated. I mean, he's been talking about that since, since certainty. But it
Right,
seems like
right.
for Heidegger, Dasein and Dasein revealing itself in its own light is an immediate being, in a phenomenological sense, and wants to get at the things themselves.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so I make the point in my essay, but I wanted to be clear that I'm not aware of anywhere that Heidegger consciously says that he's trying to avoid the conclusion of being nothing. Now, he might, because there's like some places where he kind of like hints at it, like in What is Metaphysics, right? He kind of says like being is nothing, not for the Hegelian reason, but for complicated Heideggerian reasons. Let's just put it that way. And then like Sartre seems aware of this because Sartre has a whole like section in Being and Nothingness that's actually a critique of Hegel's claim that being and nothing are the same. The argument is one that I think is a fairly common objection to dialectical arguments. Um, I'm trying to think if I can put it in simple terms. It's something along the lines of like where Sartre says that like being and nothing are opposites, but being an opposite is not the same thing as being the contradiction of something, right? Because like it's either being or not being, but like not
Yes.
being is not necessarily nothing.
Yeah, it's like it's contrary or it's difference, but it's not necessarily like the opposite in which they are like on the same plane.
Yeah. And I think Sartre's argument makes sense from the standpoint of certain assumptions of 20th century logic. And, you might find this would be an analytic philosopher's kind of instinct to it. I think that the way Sartre presents it is already pretty weak. And then I think that I could give it like, I could give a long, long, long argument that could, I think, address that particular objection of to show exactly. I mean, basically, if you look at how people prior to the 20th century conceived contradiction, it was that opposites produce contradiction. And if you look at the work of someone like Robert Brandom, I don't know if you've come across Brandom before. He's like the analytic Hegelian guy. He
Yeah,
actually,
Jean-Jacques
yeah,
brought him up before. Him and what's the other one? Pippin is
yeah,
another.
Pippin,
Yeah.
Pippin. Brandom's like a weird analytic Hegelian because he's a student of Richard Rorty, the postmodern kind of guy, and David Lewis, the possible worlds all exist guy. Like like every possible, like with the whole, because there's like that whole possible world semantics thing in analytic philosophy. He's the modal realist guy. Anyways, I studied with Brandon when I was in Pittsburgh at Duquesne. And he's a nice guy. I actually he quoted Mao at one point during a lecture. I'm like, wow. Like, but he as a I think just like to be like cool or whatever. I don't think he was doing it as a endorsement of or upholding his thought, but he has a whole way that he can like retrofit logic to kind of explain for oppositions contradicting each other. I think it kind of like maybe is too complex for like things that most of us working in continental philosophy don't already care. Like we're not already committed to this like very formalized logic in the first place. But he does have like a pretty interesting argument that involves like putting kind of possible world semantics at the bottom of logic as opposed to like being at a higher level of it. Anyways, I just wanted to mention that because that is an interesting response to
Yeah,
something.
I mean, it
Yeah.
almost sounds like, in a sense, not to bring up Mao again, but like the emphasis of primary versus secondary contradiction, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And what like, becomes, this is how Althusser will sort of appropriate it in the poor Marx text, like, which one becomes overdetermined,
Yeah, yeah. It's funny. I'm actually doing an Althusser group with Villanova students right now on 4 marks, and so I actually sent the link to Daniel's group uh for them because I was like, hey, there's like a reading group going online for it right now.
Yeah,
So
yeah, yeah. I'm a part of
um
Daniel when we just had the first session. It's really good.
yeah, yeah, I'm gonna be watching them on YouTube afterwards, although I can't attend at the moment. But anyways, okay, so being and nothing. I don't think Heidegger, I don't know if anywhere Heidegger actually says like I'm consciously trying to avoid this conclusion that being is nothing from Hegel. Um, he probably does at least hint at it somewhere. There is like a text called On Hegel that's like Gesamtausgabe, volume 69 or something like that, which I have on my desk in German, have not read. But so maybe it's in there. But I think that implicitly, Heidegger is needing to avoid this dialectic because, like, the Hegelian dialectic is something that, as Foucault said, you think you've escaped it, and then Hegel's waiting at the end of the alley, right? And so I'm kind of thinking about it from that perspective. Um, Being has to be something different than nothing for Heidegger for him to do his whole thing. And so let me give like a kind of example of this. Um, there's a famous question from Leibniz: why is there something rather than nothing? Right? And the answer that Leibniz usually gives is God. Say usually because there is a really cool essay, I think it's called On the Ultimate Origination of Things, where he says, no, it's the striving of possibles for existence. So I don't know. Leibniz is a fun philosopher, very weird philosopher, but most of the time he says, why is there something instead of nothing? God. Because God's the sufficient reason for there being something rather than nothing. And then oh, sorry, my pages fell out of order here. Okay, so Heidegger wants to have this question, but not answer it. He wants to basically think like, why is there something rather than nothing? Why is there anything? Why are there beings rather than nothing? He ends that essay, What is Metaphysics, which kind of alludes to Hegel with the being, nothing, and negation, with that question, why is there something rather than nothing? And he wants to keep it in suspension, to keep us in wonder. It's almost theological. If you look at some of the more theological deconstructionists, who are, of course, all Heideggerians, like John Caputo, represent, right? Because he's at Villanova. He gave a debate on, or he gave a talk on Shelley once. I asked a question, and he ended up trying to debate me about the fate of the entire universe and entropy and heat death. I was like, what's going on? I just asked about Shelley, but good guy. But he has like this thing called like weak theology, where it's like just
Right.
barely theology, right?
Right.
And there's like that's I feel like what's like going on here. That it's like theology without God. Like it's like, why is there, oh wow, there's something at all. That's crazy, right? Like if we think about this, I want to give a shout out to Spinoza here. So Spinoza has an interesting definition of wonder, where he says wonder is the imagining of the thing in which the mind remains fixed because this singular imagination has no connection with the others. So you're just like, whoa, what's that? And it doesn't connect to anything, so it just stays in your mind, which I think is I think Spinoza has a critique of wonder somewhere too. Maybe it was Descartes or someone else, but like wonder was not always a good category in philosophy. But like, yeah, it's just like, well, you're stupefied by something because you can't connect it to anything. And that's like, I feel like what's going on. Where he's kind of like isolating being. And it's just like, right. He always talks about thinking the difference between beings and beings. But then let's think about what happens to this question from Leibniz if we apply Hegelian logic. Well, why is there being rather than nothing? Or why are there beings? Or why is there something rather than nothing? Well, let's do a reductio ad absurdum. Let's say that there were nothing. Wouldn't that still be nothing? Right? It could be equally as curious too, right? And
Yeah.
so it really recognize that being and nothing are the same. That logic no longer works. Because something that dialectics does is it disarms like metaphysics in the like proper sense of the word. Metaphysics as like this attempt to um determine the nature of being in this kind of rigid way, or give arguments for things like, do we have free will or do we not have free will, right? Dialectical solution is to think like, no, freedom and necessity turn into each other as opposites. Like you can't have a one-sided view, um, things like that, right? Like, and so I think that that's kind of why like the nothing has to be this kind of other phenomenon. I mean, it's like he finds it in angst and stuff like that, but he doesn't really like being has to appear against the backdrop of the nothing in a certain way. Although, like in a weird way too, like nothing, like Heidegger later says, is like a weird name for being because it's like the nothingness is like in a weird way kind of a placeholder for like what's not beings, but is being. But I don't know, maybe that's just like an inconsistency there or something like that. Or maybe that's him falling back into the same logic. But like appearing, manifesting, being has to be something different than nothing for us to do a whole phenomenology of it.
Right. And I guess like, to put the dialectic in perspective, and in conjunction with historical materialism, it's like, the dialectic would be like, okay, you look at feudalism and then, you have, the crown and the serf. It doesn't mean that like its antithesis or like just its negation would be that, okay, now you have the serfs rule. No, it's that you have a sort of sublation into capitalist mode of production would
Mhm.
be, the negation of the negation, or how like this movement from being and nothing transform and determine the concept. Or like, now we're in capitalism. It's the not the just the ruling class against the workers, and then like the workers just become the next ruling class as the dictatorship of the proletariat. It's to further sublate that so there is no class at all, but
Mhm.
also in the way that it's not just this linear motion. There's also points of regression, right? um and I don't know if you agree with this thesis or not, but like you get people like Jody Dean who have like the sort of new feudalism where it's like
Mhm.
regressing back to something prior, but it's like in an inverted form. It doesn't mean like we go back to immediate feudalism, but like it's like a sort of reintroduction of it from the sort of framework of a capitalist exchange.
Yeah, interesting. I haven't read
I
that
mean,
yet.
I'm not. That was kind of like my own
Yeah.
words to paraphrase. I don't know if she would think of it like that, but I'm thinking of like the sort of Hegelian retroactivity, like onto that point of regression.
Yeah, yeah. I need to read that. I'll because Jodine's a pretty cool person. I met her actually by weird coincidence the day I first met Gabriel. When arriving at Nova, because she was giving a, I don't know why I keep calling it Nova, Villanova. She was giving a talk on the Comrade, which I think was her book before that. But yeah, I have to look more into that. But yeah, like one thing too to think about too is like and this is a point that goes back to Lacerda with the Western Marxism. Merleau-Ponty at one point says something like that communism would be absolutely other, right? So like it's not like capitalism, 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 boom, communism, right? Like, right, that there has to be a transition, there has to be a movement, because ultimately, where Hegel goes next from being a nothing is to becoming. Becoming is kind of between the two, right? Like, so, if you to take a classic example, like in logic, usually the example that you get, which I think comes from Kant, is like all bachelors are unmarried, right? So you say like, oh, like logically speaking, it's impossible for a bachelor to be married. Well, not really, because then nobody would ever get married, right? Well, I mean, I guess bachelorettes could get married to each other. I don't want to be heteronormative here, but right, like like nobody could get married unless there were married bachelors. They just cease to be bachelors the moment they're married. Well, what is like that moment of the married bachelor? It's becoming, right? Becoming is the married bachelor. It's both the bachelor and the married man. It's the moment that the two unite together and that one turns into the other, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. There is a transformation of it. And
Yeah.
I think like, someone like Marx is really at his best Hegelian when, you look at the Grundrisse's
Mhm.
notebooks, and then also like when he looks at the transformation of money into a commodity in the sort of the general formula in motions with the
Mhm.
CMC model. I think that's like in a way that money itself is the universal equivalent, but it also becomes a commodity in itself within the exchange process. There is
Oh
that,
yeah.
not just being nothing, but that transformation. Um, yeah, that's that, but that makes sense though regarding the way you put it in the analytic sense of like all bachelor or married men or unmarried men, but then how you get like the bachelor who will become married. That's the key difference.
Yeah, yeah. Greenrist is a great text for that, right? Because Marx is really starting. He's like, okay, from production. Well, we have to understand production as simultaneously consumption in all of these ways, both mediated or immediate, mediated, and immediate immediacy. So there's a sense in which, like, because one of the way I try to like understand dialectics takes every one-sided position and tries to push it into its opposite, tries to understand it from its opposite. If you look at a cause, you need to understand that cause is at the same time it is certainly affected. If you look at an effect, you need to look at the agency of that effect in producing its own being affectedness, right? Like there's something about you. This is very Spinozist. There's something about, like, if I'm affected by something, there's something about me that's causing my being affected. There's like a condition there, right? To think about things in a very linear way is very one-sided. Um, right. And so like, yeah, capitalism being transformed into socialism is a process where that system has to turn into its opposite through its own immanent dialectic. It can't just be switched for its opposite. Like we can't just like be like, okay, let's just burn it all down, and now we're gonna build socialism now. like in this like empty space, right? Um, so yeah, and so yeah, and like if you think about this, and maybe this can segue back to Heidegger, um, Heidegger's understanding of politics is very rooted in his understanding of time, and
Which was my next question is like
yeah,
the concept of time. How does that differ from Hegel's notion of time in regards to history, and what should this, you know, how should this be alarming for us Marxists that are interested in historical materialism?
yeah. So I'll give actually kind of an expanded version of some of the stuff because I know you saw the talk I gave on time previously at the critical theory workshop, but so something that's one of Heidegger's big claims alongside the ontological difference, one that some people miss because he doesn't center it all the time, but the deconstruction tradition definitely takes up is like Derrida especially, is this idea that we've typically understood time in terms of being, but we need to understand being in terms of time. So normally we operate under what, to use a phrase from Derrida, is called the metaphysics of presence, where we think that when we say something exists, we mean that it is present, like it's somewhere, it's located in a physical, like a spatial location within the present time, right? So dinosaurs don't exist, but they existed at an earlier time. They were present at an earlier time. They're no longer with us, so they no longer exist. So Heidegger thinks that being is always understood in terms of present moment time, never future or past moment time, which are understood as a past present, a present that's not yet. He traces this back to Greek etymology. There's some actual historical kind of etymological basis for what he's saying when it comes to the word ani and how the Greek language understands this. There's a famous essay from the 60s called The Greek Verb to Be by Charles Kahn that talks about some of this stuff. But the idea is that, yeah, so then if we say that time exists, then we see time as a series of nows. But we can run into a problem when we ask, does time exist? Because the past no longer exists, the future doesn't exist yet, and then the present is infinitely divisible and fleeting. And so one can draw the conclusion that time doesn't exist. And that's the kind of way that Parmenides and Parmenideans take it, or some idealists take it, because no part of time exists. Hegel's solution to this problem is to claim that the now is contradictory, that the now exists by not existing. Or to use an illustration that's quicker at a higher level, think about motion. Well, motion is just distance over time, right? Like it's a combination of space and time. But when something moves for Hegel and for Engels in the philosophy of nature, it's not here and then there and then there and then there. It's both here and there at the same time. It's both here and not here at the same time. If you think about a cartoon, right, where there's a blur, I wrote a whole essay, actually, I haven't done anything with it yet, but maybe I'll publish it at one point, talking about how cameras work from the perspective of dialectics, that it's actually an illusion that you can actually take still snapshots. Even the cameras that photograph like electrons that are faster than the speed of light cameras still have a kind of blur, as it were. It's just such a small blur that you can't see it on the image. I know about this because of shooting skateboarding, actually, right? You have to freeze the image. So,
Right. No, that's or just like a film reel. There's always going to be gaps, in between the images. Like,
Yeah. Well, even with a film reel, you ever notice like when you're watching an action movie and you pause it and the person's like blurry?
yeah, yeah,
Yeah, that's because you can shoot film. You probably noticed this on your iPhone before, and I especially noticed it when I was trying to shoot photos of skateboarding, but also shoot, video clips for my friends' Instagrams or whatever, is that you can film in much worse lighting than you can take a photograph. And it's like, wait, but isn't a film a bunch of photographs? Well,
yeah,
because if a film is blurry, it doesn't matter because it's moving. You're past a 60 frames per second, you're not going to detect a blur. 120 frames, you're it's not even going to look weird to you because your eyes don't move that fast, right? Um, and so there's a sense in which film slides are already blurred too. So things are in two places at once in films all the time. And I really do need to publish that essay. It was a fun one.
that's
Basically on that
dope.
point.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's
Um,
really cool.
yeah. And so like that's the dialectical understanding of time. Things are in two places at once. That's how motion works. Time is like the now that is by not being. It both is and is not. Just like becoming is being and nothing. Because the now, time is just becoming, but at the level of philosophy of nature. It's just back to the beginning of logic, but with nature. Um, okay, so then Heidegger's theory of time. So Heidegger has like time at different levels, but like the most primary mode of time, the most fundamental, is what he calls ecstatic temporality. Um, and this he says that the future is primary. We could maybe argue it's not actually if we were to be critical of Heidegger, but ecstatic temporality kind of comes from the past. We kind of talked about it a little bit. Like it's like I'm gonna go, like look to George Washington or whoever, right? Like, some figure, some heroic figure, because he gets this actually from Nietzsche and Nietzsche's use and misuse of history. But you look at the past and you project it onto the future. Um, and like you take the past as a model to be imitated or repeated. And this mode of time for Heidegger is most fundamental. It shows up in what he calls authenticity or authentic anticipatory resoluteness, where we basically like hold our death for certain and move towards it. Now, I want to say that like some of the existential dimensions of Heidegger aren't like untrue. It's just where he puts them in the ordering of things. Like there is a sense in which all of us do look to the past for models to imitate uh, for the future. Like I was telling my students recently that I try to relate it to them and, they're all like business students or whatever. I was like, okay, if you're going to start a business or you're going to like start your social media profile or whatever, or you're trying to like go into a field, you need to find somebody who is like 4 years ahead of you or 5 years, 6 years, 7 years ahead of you and like become friends with them so that you have a model of where you need to be and what you need to project into the future, right? So we can like, there is a sense in which we do live towards the future. But for Heidegger, that is the most fundamental sense of time, is that human thrown possibility. We're just existing towards our possibilities. I think I said in that talk, this example, it's a question that comes from Aristotle. Am I a doctor when, if I'm a professor, am I only a professor while I'm teaching? Or am I a professor at office hours? Am I a professor when I'm on the train? Am I a professor when I'm asleep? Aristotle says, well, this is a potency, right? So it's I have the power of being a professor at all times. Heidegger is different. Heidegger says what it is a possibility that I projected ahead of myself. And I'm a professor as long as I'm moving towards that possibility of being. So I'm no longer going to be a professor, not if I've lost the power of teaching, or not when I've taught my last class, but when I'm not going to teach a class in the future, right? Or you quit your job not when you've worked your last day, but when you're not going to work your next day, right? And so that's future oriented temporality for
Which
Heidegger.
is
That's
different from the Aristotelian because like, the the power is a potential, and then like, you have like in that square it's like potential, actual, and then necessity and contingency, right? And
yeah,
like, yeah, that's what he's kind of like riffing off. But Heidegger wants to focus more on like a future oriented where it's like not a power. which can be actualized based upon necessity or contingency, but the fact that it's oriented towards was it Dasein's position in time, right? That we're like time is already always future oriented. Even if we look through the past, like it's always aiming at the future.
Yeah, yeah, exactly, exactly. And that you're living in terms of where you see yourself going, not in terms of where you've been or where you immediately are. That we always are living forward. Then there's another layer of time that's derivative of this. He calls this inauthentic temporality. It is kind of just inner time consciousness, or at least that's what he associates it with from Husserl, um, which is another thing that's quite complicated. Um, Interestingly enough, Heidegger is credited with editing the philosophy of inner time consciousness or phenomenology of inner time consciousness. I can't remember what if it's philosophy of or phenomenology of book. You'll see his name on it. But I just learned via Chris Sator on Twitter that it was actually Edith Stein who did that.
Yeah, the young idealist, Chris Sator, right? Yeah,
Sator,
showing.
yeah, yeah. And so that's awful that Heidegger screwed her over in like many ways, including that way. Um, but inauthentic temporality is kind of, I guess, like ontic in the sense that it's object oriented. Or maybe it's more like circumspect. It's like caught up in the nexus of tools and significance. So like if I'm waiting on a tea kettle, this is not this whole like I'm sitting and waiting for the kettle to boil. This is not the like I'm going to create my destiny by reliving the great possibilities of the past, right? Thank God. Um, but it's like I do have this implicit awareness of being towards the future, but I'm waiting on something to be present. So it's mediated by the present. It's mediated by a presence. Um, so it's still based in ecstatic temporality, but he calls it inauthentic. Also, authentic is not like a moral connotation here. In German, it's eigentlich or uneigentlich. And something I realized at one point when reading this section is like eigen is just own. So he just means it's not Dasein's own temporality. Like it is in a way, but it's like I'm not taking it up as mine in the same way I am as if I'm like trying to be something. But it's like Uneigen in the sense of like it's another thing's temporality. I'm waiting on the tea kettle, not on myself at this point.
This seems like it's kind of leading toward like his own orientation of like alienation.
Mhm.
But like yeah, I always assumed that the sort of authentic, inauthentic was aligning with attunement, right?
Mhm.
Um, but I also like get the feeling that like this is where like someone like Sartre with bad faith in the for itself rather than the in itself like comes about
Mhm.
from this sort of inauthentic way of being and functioning in the world.
Yeah, 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 for sure. Um, yeah, because like authenticity for Heidegger is about like facing your death, being choosing to be a person. For Sartre, like it's about being free, but at the same time choosing for everyone. So it's more humanist for sure in Sartre. Um, and yeah, humanism is a whole other interesting question too, because like I don't know, like Lasordo, I think gives us I that's a whole nother debate or topic though, but it would be I think that that whole question of humanism and freedom is something that's like important again today in our post-Althusserian times. But okay, back to time. Um, the inauthentic temporality is not even what we usually take time to mean in philosophy. That's just like kind of inner time consciousness. It's still subjective. Instead, there's the more derivative level of vulgar time. So you can think about this in terms of the structure of being in time, right? So you have Dasein, who can be authentic. Then you have like Das Man, which kind of outlines like how you like just hang out in the world and swing hammers and shit like that. And then you have like theorizing, right? Which is like we're gonna make things into material objects that are like objectified in the world in an ontic way through sciences. And yes, this is all well and good, but it rests on certain presuppositions and is derivative of that more fundamental level. So similarly, you have authentic time. It's like I'm like striving to my possibility. Then you have inauthentic temporality, which is like I'm waiting on the presence of something. And then you have vulgar time. Vulgar time is like clock time in a very, very different sense. So like we invent these devices to measure time. And when we're just like everyday being in the world, we view each time as having specific meaning. So like right now it's like what 4:50 here. It's different time where you are. But yeah, like I think like okay, like I got to feed my cat in an hour and 10 minutes. She usually eats at 6, right? So that time is not just like a number, but it fits into my being in the world in a very specific way. Time, even measured time, makes sense in the horizon of what Heidegger calls a world. We could think about it as like the social practical context. He thinks that vulgar time, on the other hand, is like physics time, clock time. It's like time as a series of nows, right? Or time as in like the concept of time, right? There's a difference between like 5:30 and like a length of time that is 5 hours and 30 minutes, right? Like one of them is embedded within a social context and within timekeeping that's done for practical reasons. The other is like objective. So Heidegger thinks that vulgar time is a leveling down. That's an important concept in Heidegger. I think it comes from Nietzsche as well, of things into physical time. But he thinks that this strips all of the different moments of their significance. So 5:30 is no longer 5:30 if time is just like a thing in physics, right? It's just a now like any other now. Um, and so science generally, as we see here with this example of the scientific concept of time as a series of nows, even the most scientific, because Heidegger thinks the best version of the vulgar theory of time is Hegel's, the dialectical theory of time, where time is this contradiction of a now becoming another now, becoming another now, becoming another now, and then time is the universal now maintains itself in the singular instances of the now. It doesn't matter whether a now is 5:30 or 6 in the morning, right? Or you know noon, time for lunch, whatever, right? It's just now, 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 now. And that's where Heidegger sees it as stripping down or leveling. There's something weirdly political about this too, as a concept of leveling. Because like when you get really into like the weeds of like, Heidegger's black notebooks and stuff like that, where he really says what he's thinking, like this is like for him, like liberalism and socialism and wants to turn everybody into the same, right? Used to be called lunchtime, and now you have to treat every now as if it's just another now, right? Like, right? Like it's like this weird kind of metaphysization or metaphysical I don't know what the reification maybe is the word I'm looking for here. Of
Right. Yeah.
like
Yeah. And I was thinking of something
yeah.
too, where it's like, well, on the Marxist and it's like, uh, it's not just a bunch of series of nows, like, we have the privilege of having 5 o'clock being the time we get off of work because workers have fought for the 8 hour workday when they used to work
Right.
a lot longer back then. So like there's a sort of uh the difference between the two where it's like one is like a leveling of just pure monotony and inescapableism that is just like, waiting for like what did you say how inauthenticity would be like sort of waiting for the time to come
Mhm.
versus striving, in the authentic Dasein, striving towards one's possibility future orientedly, right? Uh,
Yeah, yeah.
and it
Yeah, you
seems
can
like
do
for
anything
Heidegger,
in the
though,
good way. Yeah, like
I
the
was just
food
gonna
thought
say,
is the one going forward too, right? So
right, yeah, yeah, yeah. And I was just gonna say, it seems like, for Heidegger, like, there is also this, and it comes from Nietzsche too, this implicit like otium to his theory of Dasein, where it's like there is the sort of leisure in which like one can be future oriented that way to be authentic, like again a bourgeois academic like he was.
right.
The ruling class could have the otium and pleasurable leisure time to be able to even think about one's fundamental facticity,
Mhm.
or aim toward their future-oriented possibility, where it's like the working class, the proletariat, or whatever, cannot have that because they're caught within, their own alienation and division of labor.
Yeah. Although you forget that Heidegger cosplayed as a peasant all the time. Do you know about this?
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. Like towards the
Like
end.
dressing up with his axe, like the Black Forest, and like live in his cabin and shit.
Yeah, yeah, he had like his own like cabin or cottage or something. He would take long walks.
Yeah. And also too, like there's something weird too, because like Heidegger, when you really get into his politics, like I mean, he was a Nazi. There are different like schools of thought within the broader Nazi movement though, and he kind of fits into that kind of like he has some affinities with some like with Junger, Schmidt, Strasser, like the kind of like left Nazism. I hate using the word like left Nazism because it's such a far right ideology, but the people who were kind of like trying to put more of like German working class vibes into the movement, pretty much, a lot of them being these people were executed as soon as like in 34 with the Night of Long Knives. Um, and so like there is a sense too in which he's trying to think about like, especially when he gets into like his like fetishizing of the German woods and like rivers and stuff, of like thinking about trying to like cosplay as a peasant too, while he's this bourgeois academic who apparently would just sit around like getting drunk watching the football game too, like, which is kind of funny to think about. Like wasn't
It,
really supposed to be around, was like
that's fun.
this sleazy dude who like yeah, that's another thing too, is like how sleazy Heidegger was. Because like we like to like romanticize all this stuff and be like, oh, Heidegger and Arendt, they were lovers. She was 18. He was like almost 40. Like he was her professor. She's like a first year student. And he's just like, hey, what's up? Like, like chill out, Heidegger. Like you're
Yeah,
supposed to
like he
be
wanted to
18.
reorient her future.
Yeah, like exactly. Like it's like and yeah, he was like, I don't know, cheating on his wife all the time. They may have had an open thing or whatever, but like, and like using like his status as philosopher, like sleep with all these models and stuff, which is like old Heidegger was doing that. It's like, what the hell? Like I
Right,
don't
but like it just shows like the disconnection between like what he writes about and fetishizes versus like his actual life. It's like he's still like a regular like bourgeois German dude, but like the sort of caricature that which he would want like sort of Dasein to be, especially like in the given context of like what you label like this sort of you know um peasant, left Nazism type thing. It just makes me think of like every other Miyazaki film where like there's this like return to nature,
yeah.
and like the sort of olden artisan life versus like the technological like advancement of modernity that's destroying like the spirit of the forest and stuff like that.
Yeah, yeah. I mean it is like, and I'm sure there are essays on Heidegger and Miyazaki, because like that's the whole like anti-technology position. Like he writes at one point, I can't remember what essay it's in. It might be in Questions Concerning Technology. It might be in another one, that like the German peasant like just like exists alongside the soil, whereas like the machinery of technology comes in and tries to extract as much value from like the soil as possible. Um, so there is a kind of sense of like wanting to go back to feudal. I mean, look at Nietzsche too. He wants to go back to a kind of feudalism. Maybe, I don't know. It seems like, I'm sure Daniel Tutt would have a more elaborate uh analysis than that, but like he does fetishize feudal relations to some extent, and the whole like aristocratic way of thinking about things. So but yeah, like it's time is very subjective for Heidegger too, and time has a subjective dimension, like, of course we shouldn't understand the subjective dimension to be the most fundamental, though. I think that's where we get into problems, and I think a lot of post-Heideggerian philosophy falls into that. Some of his analyses are interesting. I was out of material in class, so I talked about boredom. Right, boredom's a weird thing because time seems to just like drag, and so he has this whole analysis of how like, and again, I think this could be rooted in class position too. When you're bored, you just want the time to go by as quickly as possible. Although workers, deal with that too. It's like you want the workday to be over, right? And something that can like keep the workday, going. Or homeless people, right? Like a lot of like homeless people, being homeless is boring as fuck. Like you just are trying to find something to like get you through the day because you're just sitting around, you don't have anyone to talk to maybe, and
Yeah, or inmates, they're counting the
yeah,
days, waiting to get out.
yeah, exactly. And so like one thing that I think is kind of interesting about this analysis is that he talks about, isn't it weird though that like we want to live forever, we only have so much time, but then when it stares us in the face, we want to get rid of the time somehow. Like, right? Like, I mean, it's not, maybe it's not very Buddhist to like, maybe the Buddhist would just be like, oh, I can just linger in the moment or whatever. But there's something about boredom where we actually want to make time go faster, get it to move. But if we go back to like, general philosophy and whatnot, then we turn into this if we make subjective time the basis of things, as opposed to objective, like measurable scientific time, like you might not notice, like if the boss is like making time go fast for you because you can like listen to your headphone or whatever, right? You might not notice objectively the value being drained from you. That's right. Um, or they do things to like incentivize you to work faster, right? And so you're making more products per time. Like there is a sense in which I think as Marxists, even though like the workplace, like time plays this huge role in the workplace for structuring things, but understanding time scientifically, objectively, is what gives you the answer. It's not being like, oh, I've got a beanbag chair in my office now. I'm suddenly no longer being, well, you're probably not the most exploited person if you have a beanbag chair, but you are making value for that company, right?
Right. And this is so great because like, if you like juxtapose this to the economic manuscripts of 1844 prior to like the alienation or strange labor section, like he says in the right like the early beginning that like political economy reduces the worker to purely but a mouth and a stomach, right? So like sure, in the Heideggerian sense, there is this sort of boredom and this sort of anticipation of the day going by quickly. And even if there are like ways to remedy it, like pizza parties, a beanbag in your office, wearing your headphones and listening to the latest Joe Rogan podcast, one of the things that fundamentally capitalism does with your alienation is reduce you to a mouth and a stomach. So ultimately, you could have the most leisure or like just like chill boss. As Zizek likes to always talk about, like,
Right. Yeah.
postmodern boss, right? That like, oh, hugs you and wears slacks and stuff like that. But
Did
like,
you have a nice one last night?
yeah,
Right.
usually have a good fight. It's one of the best. But you're still reduced to a mouth and a stomach because the consequence of like the alienation of yourself and from others is that you constantly want to go home and drink and just consume junk because like you are literally reduced to that because you have no energy to really um do the things you want to do. And even it's hard to even be a working class intellectual, if you could use the term, to want to read all these like different theorists and get lost in the abstraction because you're just so reduced to your biology and your
Mhm.
physiology in that sense, because of alienation. I think that's just something that like Heidegger cannot account for with his Dasein that I think Marx,
Yeah.
is better at doing.
Yeah, I remember like I used to work in an Amazon shipping warehouse for a while, and like I remember like it hitting me. I was still in my 20s and there was some people there, and I was like, "Oh, like how long have you worked here?" And they're like 30 years. And I was like, 30 years? That's older like than me. And like we're working like 8 hours a day with like a shift. So it's like we're here like for 9 hours, and then there's like the driving like to and from, and it's like so like wearing. Like we've been doing this 7 hours, 7 days, or 5 days a week every day. Like this is like dehumanizing. And then I'm like, but like how could you leave at a certain point? At a certain point you get so beaten down. Like I remember a lot of the younger kids there, who were from like the really poor parts of Nashville. Like they're all like, but I'm in community college, like I'm gonna get out of here, because they still have that strength of life in them. But like the older people, the people who were like 50s, 60s or whatever, been there for like 30 years, I was like, they were like, it was just kind of like you lose the strength to break free at that point, right? you know um Not that like we're not, nobody's ever free, like whatever, but like I was just like, I just remember that like blowing my mind, that I'm just like, I would feel like so stuck, in a situation. But I'm sure like they have like the family like depending on them and all of that stuff, and like yeah, I don't know. It's incredibly alienating to put yourself in a cog in machine position like that for so long. And yeah.
Oh yeah, yeah, absolutely. I what the last question I have concerning Heidegger before we move into the last point, which is more on just on Marxism itself, is regarding what you stated towards like the end of the essay or middle end is the implicit subjective idealism. I know we touched a bit on
Yeah.
that, but maybe we could expand more because you claim just as Lukács does that there is a fundamental subjective idealism in Heidegger's thought. And what exactly does that look like in this theory of Dasein? Because I know you give like an example with the way it affects certain Heideggerians, specifically
Mhm.
like the anthropologist Bruno Latour, who will
Mhm.
fall into this thing, like for instance, saying that like, oh, Ramses the second didn't die of tuberculosis because that bacteria wasn't discovered until like what was the date? It was like 1886 or something like that.
Do
But like
that, yeah.
yeah, something like that. But like the point is like to be able to like uh reject certain discoveries of science or just fundamental material reality, the realism of that matter, because it doesn't adhere to the Dasein of Heidegger's thought, right? And you could just reject all of like the objectivity in that sense. Like it would even be like to say like, oh, gravity didn't exist until Newton got hit over the head at the apple, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Or
absolutely.
we didn't have gravity.
Yeah. Yeah, hit over the head with the apple after looking in Robert Hooke's work on gravity and then taking what Robert Hooke had already worked out and not giving him credit for it.
Yeah, that
Like, yeah. Oh, yeah, Apple, right? Yeah. Just kidding. But yeah, there, yeah, it is interesting when you study the history of science that it's like, oh yeah, but there were like tons of people besides Newton and stuff like that too. There's like all like a whole history there too. But yeah, Newton's laws not true until they were discovered. And he said that like, does that mean that like they um don't like actually pull something out about what beings are like? And he's like, no, but we just can't speak of truth existing before Dasein. Similarly, he says that like beings didn't exist before Dasein because being only appears to Dasein or only exists within the understanding of Dasein. But somehow the beings are independent and we can't like say like, oh, like there was no earth before human beings, nor can we like not like it's like somehow retroactive. I think actually like Zizek does get into that because like Zizek I think adopts some of these Heideggerian positions. I'd have to look back at it, but where he sees like the past is somehow retroactively posited by the present.
Yeah, and that's more of his like Lacanian thing, but he's trying to like apply like the Freudian Lacanian notion of repression of like a traumatic past, which is
Mm-hmm.
like, trauma comes from the future because like it's not like an actual event that happened, but something that you're trying to reconstruct because it's like cut from your symbolic understanding of your own subjective history, which I think is totally different. I think that's like one of the errors where like he does fall into Heideggerianism insofar as he's trying to like bridge this Lacan and Hegel dimension. Whereas like
Mm-hmm.
me being in Lacania, I'm kind of critical of, but that's like a sort of side tangent. But I do agree, yeah, like there's like this sort of like weird like Heideggerianism to Zizek as well.
Yeah. And I don't know, do you know Quentin Mercier
Yeah,
at all?
see, which was
On the subject?
somebody that Badiou was influenced by. I don't know too much of his work, but I'm just
Mhm.
aware of that. That's one of Badiou's
Yeah.
influences.
So it's the other way around, actually. Badiou is his teacher. It's one of
Oh, okay, okay.
yeah. So there's a book called After Finitude, which you could read in 2 days. It's really clearly written because like Badiou, like most of his students are kind of come from that Althusserian Marxist standpoint. And we as Marxists aren't trying to hide what we're doing, right? We're not trying to put on airs or be all fancy like the postmoderns. So we write in ways that are very, very clear and accessible. Mercier is somebody who writes in a way that's very clear and accessible. So you give it a read pretty quick. But it was like trending for a while. So Mercier has this argument where he basically criticizes continental philosophy as being idealism for the most part, and saying that it cannot make sense of what he calls the ancestral, that is, things like um, dinosaurs, the creation of the universe, like all these things that existed before human consciousness. because it ultimately reduces everything to human consciousness. And he calls this correlationism because it says that things are only real if they are correlates of the human mind, if they're correlates of human consciousness. And he sees there as like two different levels of them. I forget what the terms he used. It might have been weak correlationism and strong correlationism. Where like weak correlationism is like kind of like this is just epistemological. Like there is a real world, or dinosaurs are real because if there was a mind there back then, the mind would have seen it, right? That's like Husserl, for example. But then strong correlationism is the Heideggerian kind, where we can't even say that there were dinosaurs. We can just say that like there were no dinosaurs until human beings existed, and then they maybe like retroactively posited them back, or like even like dinosaurs. There are no such things as dinosaurs. There are these bones that we find, and then we create this discourse about dinosaurs to explain these bones in the present, right? Like that kind of move, which you could totally see a postmodern type of person
Oh
doing.
yeah, something like
Yeah,
Foucault, definitely. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Or was it Baudrillard who wrote like the essay? It's like Iraq War is not taking place or something.
Yes,
Like,
yeah, exactly. Yeah.
the Iraq War is a social construct, right? And something along these lines, right? And maybe I think his argument there might have been more nuanced and he's being polemical. I don't know. I didn't actually read the essay. I just know the title. But right, like that's how the way they see it. That's the way that Latour sees it. And so yeah, Mercier has this whole critique of that correlationism. He has a good like polemical point. I think it's in the book where he says that creationists make the same arguments, where they say God just put like God created the world in 6 days in a way that made it look like it existed beforehand. Right? Like like he just like put the shit there. It's like, aha, dinosaurs, but they weren't really there until I created it. Like
That's
like and Mercier has like his own kind of solution. So he starts by kind of defending Descartes actually, which is I think admirable. And but then he goes to Hume for this crazy argument that I think most people recognize at the end of the book is like like he like a classic student of Badiou like invokes some like mathematical theorem from set theory that hasn't been proven that like somehow gives him an absolute or whatever. That part is kind of weird, but the core of the argument of like diagnosing correlationism is quite good. It repeats a lot of the points that Lenin himself already mentioned in the materialism and empirio-criticism essay, which I mentioned in the article. And so this is this idea, this subjective idealism is based in this idea that like there is no being outside of Dasein. Now, Heidegger, I don't think would say that like the sciences are false, but he would say the sciences reveal things in terms of basic concepts. And the reason that it's not just that like Aristotelian physics was wrong, it's that Aristotelian physics like revealed things with a different like mode of being. Now, I think that this like post-Heideggerian contextualist historical approach, which has some resonances with historical materialism, there are some like good things that came out of it. Like you can kind of come from this perspective and be like, okay, I don't want to like just think of everything in the past as like mythology, right? Like there is some really very strange science out there. Um, Especially if you read Aristotle's theory of like sexual reproduction, stuff like that, like some of the more dirty parts of Aristotle, there's some very strange stuff. But it is very interesting to go and look and think about what are the reasons that these people thought this way. All right. Like, why did Thales think everything was made of water? What did he think the world looked like? What kind of explanatory power did that have? Right. Like, it's not true, but there's a sense in which it made sense to him. All right. That's really interesting. I think everyone should do that. It's a healthy exercise. Where we get into problems is when we kind of just see all of science as kind of just making shit up, right?
right. And one of the things I like, this is like kind of like a side point, but it aligns with like this way in which like science plays into the history of thought. So there, you mentioned Quentin Meillassoux and Badiou. Another contemporary of Badiou alongside like Sylvain Lazarus is Jean-Claude Milner, who I believe is still alive. I don't know if you know of Milner.
That's the Isn't he the Lacan guy too, or is it or
Yeah,
the
yeah,
Hegel?
he's the
Yeah,
Lacan guy. So he wrote a text called the Clear Oeuvre, like pretty much like understanding if Lacan has a sort of coherent thought. But the way that he kind of categorizes, or not categorizes, but kind of lays out like a sort of history of science is through what he calls like different breaks. And this comes from like the thesis that comes from well, two people, like Kojève, the Hegelian, and also Alexander Koyré, the French thinker of philosophy of science, and like he was also big into like the Greeks, like Plato and Aristotle. But like in that, like sort of thought of antiquity, the science that prevailed has like a relationship with theoria and praxis, as well as episteme. Episteme is huge, of course, in science back then, but techne was like divorced, right? So like there was no theory of techne or expansion of the techne. And it isn't till like the rise of modern science because of the way things become more mathematizable. Like in the way like we brought up Leibniz and even Descartes, one of the great things about Descartes was that he was a great mathematician and scientist, with the realm of the res extensia.
Mhm.
But like what he's getting at is that like science changes along with the break of a worldview from a worldview of logos and harmony, and even the worldview of the Christians into a worldview where the universe, the cosmos, is mathematizable because the rise of technology is now included into the theory and praxis of science, which is about precision. So once you create precise models, that changes the way that things could be revealed. And so I thought that was like kind of interesting, and in a way it's like kind of aligns with, in a sense, like a way that like uh again, because this comes from like Poiret, like something like a Foucault or like a Heidegger would like theorize like the history of
Yeah.
science, and the way that it's looking at the breaks of the discourse. But I do think that it adds something more because it's still privileging like the concrete materiality of science, but it's like aiming at the sort of um discursive breaks, uh
Yeah.
which I
Yeah.
think like
The,
Heidegger, the
the,
Heideggerianism is still like caught within discursive reality, which would be more Foucauldian
yeah.
and Derridian, but like it's the Heideggerian influence.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's like, I mean, I have my own opinions about the history of science and stuff like that too. I'm not sure if I could give a sweeping conclusion about it. But yeah, there is this tradition of French epistemology, and then there are a lot of people who are reading Heidegger too. Yeah, because like there's like Bachelard and what's the guy? I can't pronounce it, but begins with a C. How
Canguilhem or whatever.
William, yeah, that
Yeah,
guy.
he was like he was influential to Foucault, right? Because he talks a lot about like instincts and animal life, right?
Yeah, Cavaillé is the other guy too. He's the guy who he like fought in the resistance and stuff too, if I remember right. And like,
And it's funny because that like Bachelard and Cavalier, they both influence, and Jacques Martin influence Althusser for this understanding of the problematic, which comes
yeah,
from Heidegger, and then the epistemological break.
right, yeah. I didn't know the problematic. I should look that up. I have some friends who like really work on French epistemology and are interested in it, but yeah, I'm not always like convinced by some of the epistemic break stuff because I think like I don't know, it's like a tangent, but I think like Althusser forgets too that how much philosophy and science were intertwined with each other back then. Like Descartes, the first law of motion was proposed by Descartes. We don't think of Descartes as like Newton, but he was like the Newton of his day.
Right. And Leibniz with calculus.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
Leibniz invents calculus, right? And Leibniz was the one the who proposed his own law of motion too. He was the one who he proposed like a change to the Cartesian law of motion. All these people working on these things. Hegel's dissertation was on the orbit of the planets. Right? And so like, yeah, we think of philosophy and science as these very different things, and maybe they're not. I mean, well, I guess we're Marxists, so we have a science and a philosophy that are kind of the same thing, but
Yeah, yeah, and I mean Kant too. He like studied like meteorology and like he was obsessed with like astronomy as well. So like even he was invested with science.
he has his own system of physics too.
Yeah, 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 yeah. Yeah, I forgot about that. Yeah, I've been trying to get into Kant's lectures, and I find them a lot more fascinating and kind of supplementary to the three critiques. So I do find that interesting. But like I guess now since you mentioned like Marxism and we have a science as well, I guess now we could go into Marxism itself, many thinkers, without listing a who's who, have implemented Heidegger into the leftist and Marxist thought due to this emphasis of being in the world. And this is due to like assumptions that Marx lacks a theory of the subject. But do you think that really holds weight? While, I will disagree and we could go into tangents about why, many people don't see like a subject in Marx or Marxism, apropos something like Dasein, which we've been talking about so long. And many people like Marcuse try to, implement, Heidegger and marry Marx, together. Or like the subject of care and this sort of like ethics of care in Foucault, and then the advantage in Badiou, or like the subject of Zizek, etc. Like, what are your thoughts on that? And like, how does that relate to, Marxism today? And even like its question concerning not only like theory, but even like praxis, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, okay. So this is an interesting question. I would say that first of all, I'm gonna just like preface this by saying like I don't think I have the answer to this question, but I think it is a problem that I would like to investigate at some point in the future because I don't know, like I have like provocations sometimes that I like carry around that I like to use, at certain times. And so my latest provocation is asking people what we mean by what does the word subject mean? What are we talking about when we say subject, and why does Marxism need it? Because a lot of people talk about this. People that I know like will say like, oh, like we're trying to come up with a notion of subject, or like, oh, we need a concept of like the subject for the as the proletariat. And like it's like, oh, like so and so is just arguing this point because they we can find a notion of the subject here. And I'm just like, I'm not sure what we're talking about anymore. What's the subject? And then, of course, nobody can ever, it's really hard to explain what people are even talking about. I've heard some good explanations. I actually, sitting on a class, I made the same exact point like then, where I'm like, I'm not sure what the subject is or what we mean by it anymore. But the explanation I usually get is that it's like the agent of action. Um, and so I guess like here's what I would say. Like questions like this, like very basic questions about things that we take for granted are really important. A question like, what is the subject? Why do we need it? Because people like Zizek, people like Badiou, Althusser, all these figures will talk about the subject, but won't say, and by this I mean this, and here's why we need it, and here's how it connects to practice. And so I would basically say that like those questions are important. Investigating terms, right? Or difference, right? A lot of like French philosophy is like, oh, difference. And Gabriel has this point where he says, Gabriel Rockos has this point where he says like something like, you will never find, like they will say everything needs to be criticized, eminent critique of everything. It's like, you will never find an eminent critique of the concept of difference. Like you're never going to find them ever questioning whether or not they should frame everything in terms of difference. It's never going to be there. And so I think that those kinds of questions that really take it like into account, like what is the subject? Why do we need it? And how would we do this? Okay, let me first say something about the Heideggerian stuff. I have a suspicion, and it's just a suspicion at this point. I haven't proven it yet, that some of this discussion of the subject is born out of a Heideggerian framework. I made a joke the other day where I said like, like my job is to sniff out Heideggerianism and Marxism. Right, that's my self-appointed role. Because for Heidegger, most of the time we're not subjects. Most of the time we're the they self, we're Das Man. And it's only this like call of conscience that pulls us out of our like immersion within the they self. And let me just explain for your listeners what the they self is. So in German, like when you ask someone, how do you say XYZ? You would say, wie sagt man? And so it's like, wie, how, sagt says man. The word man here is like, it's not M-A-N-N, man. It's like one. How does one say? And so Heidegger makes a pun on this because it's like the source of your idea of like, what should I do kind of thing. Like it's what we do when we don't like actually make a decision. Our life isn't a project. I asked my students, I was like, why are you here? Why are you in college? And, some of them had answers like get a job, get money, and all this stuff. Because I was trying to get them to, with Aristotle to get to the idea of like, oh, the good or whatever, like, oh, I'm seeking the good life. But a lot of them had no answer. And I wonder if the reason is because they did it because that's what you do, right? That's the they self. But for Heidegger, death, authenticity, forcing the being forced to choose a possibility brings us out of the they self into authenticity. And at that point, we become a self, we become a subject. And so I have a question about like, is there a sense in which, you know, just like for Heidegger, we become a subject or authentic by being summoned before the throne of the nothing or whatever, right? Like through certainty of our own death, that this is where some of these subjects, ideas of the subject are coming from in the Althusserian Marxist tradition. Badiou with the event, turning people into subjects. Althusser as well, that he talks about interpolation, turning us into subjects. I actually think interpolation is a really interesting concept, and that it has a lot of use. Um, Zizek's really interested in the subject. I'm not sure exactly why. He just talks about subjects a lot. Maybe
Well,
there's
for
yeah,
Zizek at least, it's like because he's thinking about Hegel's notion of the subject, and he's
yeah,
resuscitate it, in a way that like the subject is not like the sort of thinking, you know, subject in the form of like a metaphysics of presence, and this is why he needs like Lacan to kind of like back him up. It's more of like the subject is like that sort of remainder that escapes and comes back retroactively. It's like uh I guess the way to kind of explain it's like no matter how much you try to totalize something, some remainder is always left. That is the sort of thing that keeps the absolute from being whole. Like, for Hegel from his reading, I guess.
yeah, and that
Or
would be
like
this.
put it in like capitalist terms, like, capitalism and the state can never fully enclose and totalize everything. There's always going to be a remainder, and it's always going to be sort of something that's excluded, and it's always the proletariat.
Okay. Yeah, yeah, that kind of makes sense in a Badooian way too. I can see that. Um, yeah, so like I'm more familiar with subject from German idealism, where it's just like it's the I, it's the Cartesian cogito, it's the I think that thinks itself and thinks objects and thinks itself through thinking objects. And so there's like I'm not sure how those things connect either. I think so. Yeah, there's probably people who have thought through this in greater detail, and someone like Daniel Tutt, right? For example, than me. But I would say that in Marxism, the test of any concept is practice. So like basically I would regarding the subject, if we're going to talk about the subject via Badiou, via Althusser, via Zizek, via all these people, I would just basically ask what's the use value of the concept of the subject? How does theorizing this way help us solve real practical problems that we could not solve without theorizing this way? So is there a way that if I have a theory of a subject and I'm organizing workers, that me understanding how they become subjects can show me a course of action that can better organize them? Do you know what I mean? Like, so that's
Yeah.
like where I'm really like seeing like,
Yeah, and why like I ask this question is because there's also this thing about like the subject of history, right? And I think that's like the sort of reason why this notion of the subject needs to be brought up for many of these thinkers and those that tend to say they align more with a theory of communism revamped, because of like what side is the subject of history on, right? And it's like sort of to avoid like falling into like voluntarism or like crude Stalinist version of historical materialism. So I guess that was the sort of motivator for the question. Yeah.
yeah, that makes sense. So like the proletariat basically as the subject of
Y-
history.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I guess I'm still like, I guess there I would just be thinking about like, how can we frame this question in a way that really like identifies like what the concept of subject or subjectivity or something along these lines is like doing for a theorizing there? Because like if it's just consciousness, right, then of course like right the proletariat needs consciousness, right, needs theory to be able to engage in practice. But yeah, I guess like I would say that I feel like I'm the wrong philosopher to ask this question because I don't use the subject in the way that Lacan or Althusser or Zizek uses in my own kind of trying to make sense of things.
But
But
I guess, yeah, I guess now thinking about like if you even want to bring it in terms of consciousness, not trying to conflate the two, but like let's just say like there is a sort of uh, a group which thinks and has a sort of agency to aim at. It's like, bringing up Lukács with, the class consciousness for itself and in itself, right? So like is that like, what would help us, propel like not just as like intellectuals, but those that also work in organizing the proletariat, whether it's from workers, unions, students, anybody that does not own the means of production, that has to, sell their labor and time for a wage.
Yeah. So like the standpoint stuff, I'm wondering actually I haven't read History and Class Consciousness in 6 years. And when I read it, I was still kind of newer at Marxism. So I'd like to go back and give it a reread. But yeah, I think some of the stuff in Lukács is helpful because intrinsically as Marxists, we have to attribute, I mean, we have to take the standpoint of the proletariat, regardless of our own class positionality, and argue for that standpoint. But then there's a difference between the standpoint that the proletariat ought to have, given the objective circumstances that they're in, and the kind of subjectivity that they ought to have through a theoretical like grasp of things and the grasp of their interests. And then there's the subjectivity that they do have, right? And our goal should be to bring them towards that kind of subjectivity that would be class conscious, right? Um, and there are like different levels to this too, because it's like dialectical, because every person within like the broader workforce has contradictory levels of class allegiance and class subjectivity, I guess. So like, right, like white workers in the US benefit from settler colonialism. Um, the industrial proletariat has a key strategic position, but is more paid off than the service industry, who don't have the same level of strategic position in when it comes to a revolution, but are more exploited in terms of being like really working at. I'm gonna get everyone mad at your podcast. Working at Starbucks as a barista, you probably make less than working at like a mine or something, or like a heavy industrial job, right? So yet taking over a heavy industry is probably going to cause be more strategically valuable than taking over a single Starbucks, just because of the order of the supply chain, right? And so there's like all
Yeah.
these kind of different levels of subjectivity, contradictory levels of subjectivity. And I think that analyzing all of those things is really helpful and really useful.
Right. And one of the things though that is interesting because talking about standpoint and the subjective position is fellow comrade mentioned earlier, C. Derek Barn has some criticisms of Lukács regarding like, the history and class consciousness work, whereas like, he's definitely more of a fan of the destruction of reason. But one of the sort of critiques is this point on standpoint because it's not necessarily from Lukács himself, but some readers and those that will use standpoint epistemology to sort of frame the way in which like a certain subjective standpoint has insight, inherent insight to a knowledge
Right.
that no one has, and that is where it becomes problematic. Not even just to say that oh the proletariat has insight to something that like the bourgeois doesn't, but it's like on the level of like well then it becomes like oppression Olympics, oh like
Mhm.
us like uh and this is not to bash anybody that it's marginalized or like on the LGBTQ plus community, but the way that it's like reified in liberalism is
Yeah.
that they will say that, oh, cis people don't understand our suffering in the way we do. And this is where like it becomes reified, or, with the feminist movement, um, where standpoint becomes hijacked by liberalism and reactionary
Right.
forces to then obfuscate proletarianization or to universalize as a class, for lack of a better term. But I think
Yeah.
that's like where like we have to be like really critical when it comes to like the standpoint of like the proletariat, because like I think it is more revolutionary than like what we see, and you even see it in academia, and it comes back to the Heideggerianism of like lived experience narratives, in the way that like Heideggerian influence affects, you mentioned earlier, decolonial literature, in which we start from the decolonial subject as aiming towards some new possibility of difference that will somehow be, um, you know, not the revolution, but somehow will be like monumental for a new type of not even society, but discourse, right? Because it always goes back to narrative, textuality, and discourse, and this is where you get like the Heideggerian, Derridian influence. And this is like
Mhm.
something that is like we're trying to get as like proletarianized subjects, not at the level of text, but at the level of concrete materiality,
Mhm.
transforming conditions of society, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I remember like because academia and the left in general, like the standpoint stuff that Derek criticized was something that was like really intimidating to me at first, especially because like there's like these contradictory forces in academia where they're like, okay, you need to work on minority figures, you need to work on, feminism, and you need to work on, like people who are black or indigenous and all this stuff, and do all your work on that. But as a white person, you also can't say anything about it. And I'm like, wait, how do I do both those things? Like I don't do it, like, and so like inherently, like I remember like there being like this thing was like, I don't know, I'm just gonna shut up now. My students, that's their default because I teach a lot of like Black Panther stuff. I teach Fanon and all this stuff and like Césaire, and they're just like, colonialism's bad, but I don't want to say anything because I'm afraid I'm going to say the wrong thing. And then I remember one of my friends said this stuff once where he says like, I can't speak to these experiences, but I've read these books and I can tell you what they said about their experiences. And I was like, oh, that's the solution right there, right? Like that actually makes a ton of sense. That is like such a clear way to put it, right? Like, he's like, I can tell you what the book said. Like I don't know anything about what it is like to be black, but I've read Huey Newton talk about what it's like to be black, and here's what he says in his book. And isn't that interesting, right? And like, so I think that like there is like a sense in which like one can like the standpoint of epistemology can be extreme to the point of being like a person can never understand what another standpoint is like. Yet people write books about what their positionality is like all the time, right? So that it seems to imply that they're trying to communicate what their position is like. Um, Now, could you like purely like does that mean that like you should like this you have to do that, like sometimes you have to like teach this to students, like especially I don't know, white women for some reason like always think like, yeah, that reminds me of this one time where I experienced something similar. I'm like, no, it's not similar, right? Like like but I think like the way there are a lot of like contradictions from like standpoint epistemology that I think are need to be carefully worked through. Like one assumption with some decolonial theory, not all of it, a critique that Jennifer Ponce de Leon has made before is that like she calls it a kind of like new version of like the Rousseau's noble savage, where it's like just because a discourse comes from indigenous people doesn't mean it's true, right? They could, or just because like be like, oh, this is like ancient indigenous metaphysics, this is our solution for evolution, or like, well, okay, does it work in practice,
Right, because one of the things that the Nazis were doing, they were obsessed with a lot of like ancestral, like mystical traditions. They were obsessed with the Vedics. They loved the Bhagavad Gita. And so like, like with that claim too, it makes me think of I think it comes from Hegel. It's like the mysteries of the Egyptians were the mysteries for the Egyptians themselves.
Yeah.
And so like, that's where like there is a flaw in taking that
Mhm.
standpoint, especially in the colonial literature.
Yeah. That's funny because the Germans are still obsessed with Native Americans and they will dress up and play Native American still to this day, which is like, it's like, oh my gosh, what are you doing, Germany? Like, I don't know. And there's like a whole, like, yeah, like actually, Soviet films about Native Americans are really interesting. They're done in the style of Westerns, except the cowboys are the bad guys, and the native, the Indians or the Native Americans are like the good guys, the colonizers. Which I did a report on that once. It's a weird thing from East Germany during the time. But yeah, like as far as like Lukács and standpoint goes, and like subjectivity and things like this, like yeah, I think it's important to not like think that just because right like yeah, like I don't know why I just thought of this, but I just remember like I showed an episode of Boondocks in class once. Are you friend the Boondocks, right?
Oh yeah, I love that
Like,
cartoon.
yeah, and like I just remember like one of my white students came up to me afterwards and she's like, "What is with Ruckle Ruckus? Like I don't understand this. Like he's a black guy who hates black people, right? Like it's like right, just because he has the personality, it doesn't mean that like like she's like what."
He's got Rehabilitation, but he's got like the Confederate flag in his background. So good.
Yeah. And so like, right, like just because like, like, and that's where like, I think sometimes identity politics becomes a buzzword for it's too vague of a term, identity politics. What do we mean by it, right? Do we mean like fighting for the liberation of women and minorities? I'm all for that. If that's what identity politics is, I'm down. But sometimes people mean by it liberal representational, right? Like, and this is where the bad standpoint epistemology comes in, where it's like, oh, Kamala Harris, she's black, so her policies must be the best policies for black people, right? Or Candace Owens, or all this kind of stuff, right? And so like, I mean, it seems like it should just be very obvious to people that a person's opinions are not 100% determined by their background. But then again, that's what racism is in the first place, is thinking that you can just immediately think what a person is by their appearance. So
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it was you. You posted something on Facebook prior to the election that was an interview by like Kamala Harris or with Kamala Harris, and she was like dodging the question, asking if do you think like the LGBTQ plus community should have the right to gender affirming care? And she was dodging the question by not answering it at all. And then like when she finally was acknowledging it, was just saying that that's something that should be uh acknowledged between that person and their primary caregiver, right? It's a doctor confidentiality thing, but it's like it's not on the level of the doctor when it has to do with the legal policy that you are in charge of. So
yeah,
like yeah, you know.
yeah, yeah. And at the same time, like there is a kernel of truth to positionality, in the sense that like something I've talked to people that I no longer associate with, who have turned more reactionary, let's just put it that way, um, is like, they, the kind of like people like talk about like the whole like, I don't know, this is something I used to say to the people who now are very openly anti-LGBTQ Marxists, where I've just been like, dude, as a professor, like if you see like queer students in class, you know that they're going to be communists by the end of the semester, right? Like, like because they're like already rejecting the system. And so you're just like, hey, read this stuff. Like this is like stuff you're like, you're really going to dig, because you're like already questioning reality, right? Similarly with like um the black students in class typically like to read Fanon and Malcolm X and Walter Rodney and all of these figures, right? Does that mean every single black student is like, oh wow, like I'm like really into black nationalism? No, right? But like generally speaking, like they'll get more out of it than the white students because of their background. Like that is a positionality thing, right? It's about thinking about it not too rigidly, right?
Right, and it just goes back to the way they were like reflecting with one, their historical struggles that are a part of, their identity, which there is a difference, as a in different identities and the history that comes with it, and that's completely different than standpoint epistemology, in which like one subject has something inherently true. Which again, you just said it's like, well, then we're just bringing back racism, in a crude way. And this leads me to my last question for the interview, which is like, bringing up again Lacerdo, like what are the benefits and the utility that you think he has? Because one of the things that he does talk about, which I feel like breaks away from the ways in which class struggle by many, sadly many Marxists and those that want to criticize Marxism, is for being so rigid on the class that they're being not only like class reductive but also binary as like
Mhm.
just like capitalist worker. But like for Lacerdo, it's like no, it's a multiplicity of struggles. On the one hand, you do have the struggle for the proletariat on the level of the exploited worker and the capitalist, but then you have humanist struggles for recognition, which are going to be the struggles against racism, against sexual oppression, against colonial national liberation, and it's all around the imperial core that he's using his historical method around.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, I'm a big fan of Lasordo's work, especially his method for looking at individual thinkers in the history of philosophy, which we've already talked about to some degree, about how he like lines them up on issues. And I'm very influenced by that. Um, I haven't read everything he's written. I've read, like War and Revolution and Class Struggle in one of Gabriel's classes a long time ago, and I really want to go back and revisit them because they're great. Um, but I think like Lasorda is really good for our time for the following reason. We need what the correct like line or position that we have needed for Marxists, given like both like the CIA and otherwise propaganda against Marxism and like the kind of like attacks and things going on like this, is that we need a way to both remain true to Marxism and proletarian struggle without falling into the trap of class reductionism. And there have been plenty of class reductionist movements where one basically sets aside all other forms of struggle as identity politics, quote unquote, identity politics, whatever that means, and then seeing the struggle of basically people who wear hard hats as the only legitimate form of struggle. And this can take other forms too, right? You can be too focused on materiality and labor and forms of like labor-based oppression and ignore elements of the feminist struggle or the LGBTQ struggle that can't be tied directly to exploitation in the sense of exploitation for labor, but have to do with either larger elements of social reproduction or have to do with kind of maintaining like superstructural things, like, right, like it's like transphobia. Part of it is very much rooted in maintaining a certain kind of patriarchy and masculinity and things like this, right? Like it's rooted in that kind of psychology of oppressive male dominance, right? And so it's seen as like transphobia and homophobia are like rooted ultimately in this kind of wanting to project a certain kind of male power, right? That is seen as a threat to. And so, yeah, what Lasorda brings is this framework of seeing struggles as united, as class struggle being in the plural. Because I think that what we need to be doing if we want to win is the kind of thing that Fred Hampton was doing, bringing struggles together. Because the thing that our enemies want us to be doing is to be fighting amongst ourselves instead of fighting against them. They want us to be fighting about like, you know, uh, oh, like, why is all the focus on like LGBTQ rights? What about the proletariat, right? Why can't we have both? Right? Like they want us to be fighting about this. They want us to be fighting about like, oh, like, you know, you're just focused on black workers, why not white workers, or vice versa, right? Oh, we need white workers and black workers, right? Like, like and those struggles are different, and there's ways that black workers need support that white workers like you're not facing the same level of police brutality and like things like this, right? Like there's all these interconnected sides of struggle, and I think that the best strategy is to fight all these battles, right? To make a unified alliance of people against all forms of oppression. And I think that, yeah, what's important about Lasorda and his use of the term recognition, which he takes from Hegel, and this has really changed my position too on recognition, right? Because you remember like people, like a lot of people like Zizek, even for instance, like he associates recognition primarily with like liberal Hegel, like Random, Pippin, all stuff like that. But like he's like totally right that if you look at the history of anti-colonial struggle, if you look at like the Bandung Conference and all these things, like what they wanted was their recognition of their rights, recognition of their freedom, recognition of their national autonomy. Kwame Nkrumah put it this way: the right of nations to govern themselves badly, right? It's like, oh, you're saying like we're gonna do a bad job governing ourselves? We want the right to even just govern ourselves badly. And so I think that that is really attractive to as a position. And I think that's why Lasorda is resonating so well with people, is because we see the potential for bringing these struggles together into a larger struggle. We see that like, and then like people just generally are fed up with the system. And the people who are the most fed up with the system are the people who are the most exploited by it. And I think that that's the kernel of truth. A lot of people criticize intersectionality. I don't. I think intersectionality is a very dialectical and Marxist concept. It just has to not be liberal, representational kind of like we were talking about standpoint in the bad sense intersectionality, but it needs to be intersectionality that really recognizes the revolutionary potential of people who have overlapping levels of oppression, because directly they're already going to be pushed in the direction of fighting, like an LGBTQ person is already going to be pushed in the direction of fighting for recognition on that front. A Black LGBTQ person or a minority LGBTQ person is already going to be fighting against white supremacy, right? And then add proletariat, and then like right, you have the intersection of these struggles together, right? And so like I think that there is a sense in which um these the Lasordo provides a framework that addresses those problems of intersectional struggles without liberalism in that sense of representational idealist politics, but rooted in a class struggle, rooted in Marxist materialist politics, right? That's what I would say about Lasordo in that regard.
You're right. No, and it's perfect sense because like, even in the class struggle text, he does bring up it's in the section where he's criticizing Hannah Arendt
Mhm.
succinctly, by delegitimizing exploitation
Mhm.
from the Marxist understanding of it, and also for her being a historian, fails to account for the way that like Marxist theory, revolutionary theory, is in this aligned with the tradition that comes from the Jacobin,
Mhm.
in the French Revolution, and the way that these thoughts of revolutionary struggles influence like what's his name, who the general who led the slave revolt in Haiti, Toussaint de Louverture,
Mhm.
like these people right here were not only exploited and oppressed, but they were able to overcome that and lead a chain of slave abolition movements to come, where she'll say like, people like that are only exploited because of nature itself, and exploitation is just an effect of just nature. And the only people that could really think about freedom are those that have the ability to freely think, and slaves and people that are oppressed don't have that by the clutches of nature, so therefore we don't have to rely on that. And so like the one that's just very crude, and also it's also funny to see people post Hannah Arendt like in times like today thinking that she's somewhat revolutionary when I think like in my honest opinion she'd be pro-Trump if she were
Yeah.
alive today. But yeah, like in that chapter, he talks about like how the history of not only proletarian struggles but also struggles for recognition, they aren't perfectly aligned. They definitely have their own contradictions within each other, but the point is to recognize them in the multiplicity of struggles that is class struggle. All history hitherto has been a history of class struggles, as Marx and Engels have said. It's just we have to look at it like in the light of not just like the workerism and purely the capitalist. So I mean, yeah, I mean that's all I have to add to that. And again,
Mhm.
thank you for coming on, and thank you
Yeah,
for,
pleasure.
yeah, talking about this wonderful essay. There is a part two to it, right? That's in the making. Or
There's supposed to be three parts, but due to circumstances, I got delayed on that. But I'm gonna finish the series at some point. Actually, like it might be nice for like some kind of bigger publication at some point too, because I think like there's a need for this kind of book. But I don't know. Maybe I won't attack Heidegger until I get a tenure track job, which hopefully will happen soon. Or but like right, because then like they're gonna be like, wait, well you hate Heidegger, I'm a Heideggerian. It's weird that academia is like that, where they don't want you to fight too much, right? But yeah, hopefully I'll finish the series soon, maybe this, summer or something like that. But yeah, there's gonna be a part two and a part three.
awesome. Well, if there's anything else you want to plug in, feel free.
Yeah,
Uh,
well, yeah, I mainly am on like Twitter, and you can also find my Substack as well. I started a TikTok and a Red Note, but it's been like too hectic teaching to go record videos, so I haven't posted on it in a minute, but I still have stuff there as well. But yeah, that's where you can find me. Thank you so much. This has been a blast. So thank you for having me.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, and you're a fellow comrade, so I hope to bring you back on in the near future whenever you have part two or part three or any other work,
Yeah.
I plan on doing a talk on Hegel, so definitely come back for the Hegel stuff. So, and
I'd
thank
love to.
everybody for viewing this wonderful conversation, and stay tuned for more, because at the end of the day, this is not, I said in the beginning of the podcast, but this is more of and along the lines of like exegesis and discussion in the way that fellow comrades like Varn and Tut, we're discussing, we're engaging, and it can be complex. It can't be daunting with these concepts. It could make you feel out of the loop, but the point is to continue engaging and learning and being open to that because it should transform your consciousness for the transformation of material conditions, not just a merely navel gazing exercise. So, thank you all, and I hope you have a wonderful day.